como decíamos, sobre todo que ve la inflación al 2% en los próximos años. Las expectativas están, en el caso de la inflación, ancladas, dice Williams, las presiones de inflación relacionadas con la vivienda por lo menos disminuyen. El retroceso de la inflación ha sido generalizado, la demanda de vivienda sigue fuerte, cierta desinflación proviene de fuera de Estados Unidos y dice también la incertidumbre sobre las nuevas políticas gubernamentales están frenando a algunas empresas, dicen desde la FED. Y antes de seguir, tenemos una noticia de última hora. Israel acusa a Hamás de hacer demandas de último minuto. Hamás, dice un funcionario israelí, estaría haciendo nuevas demandas de último minuto, lo que podría hacer peligrar el tratado del alto el fuego. Una fuente política de alto nivel afirma que el equipo negociador israelí fue informado de que Hamás ha presentado nuevas exigencias en el último minuto con respecto al corredor Filadelfia, contrarias a los mapas aprobados por el gabinete y los mediadores estadounidenses. Israel se opone firmemente a cualquier cambio en estos mapas. Por otro lado, Hamás le ha dicho a Al Jazeera que su delegación ha entregado a los mediadores su aprobación al acuerdo de alto al fuego en Gaza. Noticia que comparte, como decíamos, el medio árabe Al Jazeera. Y también, relacionado con este tema, el primer ministro catarí se reúne con los negociadores de Hamás en su oficina para dar impulso final a ese alto el fuego en Gaza, el acuerdo de liberación de rehenes, según una fuente de las conversaciones. Pero todo esto podría peligrar porque Israel está diciendo que Hamás hace demandas de último minuto. En los próximos minutos vamos a hablar de inversión en el metal dorado, en el oro. Vamos a saludar ya a Francisco Javier López Milán, CEO de Silver Gold Patrimonio. Muy buenas tardes.
Muy buenas tardes.
Javier, ¿cuáles son las previsiones para este primer trimestre de 2025 en cuanto al oro?
Pues la verdad que como no han cambiado las circunstancias geopolíticas, ¿no?, la demanda del metal, y que en las últimas semanas del último año pasado no se llegó a alcanzar los objetivos que estaban previstos, sinceramente en este primer trimestre esperamos ver el oro alrededor de los 2.000, entre 2.800 y 2.850, que ya tenía que haber alcanzado al final del 2024, y la perspectiva tanto para el oro como para la plata y el resto de los metales preciosos es seguir siendo un año de crecimiento, obviamente más tranquilo para el oro y la plata, pero también con bastantes posibilidades para otro tipo de metales.
Los que se conocen en este momento, ¿qué nivel de acumulación de oro existe en los bancos centrales?
Pues fíjate que finales del 2021 había unos 35.000 toneladas guardadas en los bancos centrales. Ahora mismo está alrededor de los 44.000 toneladas de metal en general, que supone aproximadamente 3 billones, pero billones europeos, no americanos, de dólares en valoración de ese tipo de metal. Siguen acumulando, siguen queriendo reforzar su propia moneda con el metal, pues obviamente pierden toda la confianza en el dólar, incluso en el euro, y resulta de que, bueno, pues la perspectiva es que sigan este año con una acumulación y además a marchas forzadas,
Hay dirías desde Silver Gold, ¿hay algún producto de inversión comparable al oro en cuanto a acumulación de valor?
Como producto de inversión, sinceramente, todo aquel que tenga producto de inversión que tenga realmente detrás algo que valga per se, que sea con su propiedad. Si me dices el oro, te dirá la plata. Ahora, si me dices con productos, yo sinceramente, bueno, hay productos financieros, productos que están acumulando muchísimo valor, como son las criptos, pero soy bastante reacio a considerarlos como reserva de valor cuando realmente detrás no tenemos nada que sustente esas valoraciones. Sí puede existir algún tipo de contratos que vayan referenciados a otro tipo de activos, acciones de empresas solventes, que puedan generar esa acumulación de valor, pero sinceramente desde nuestra posición seguimos apostando como valor refugio único y exclusivamente los metales preciosos.
¿Qué otros metales representan ahora una buena oportunidad de inversión?
Pues aparte de la plata, que va acompañando, incluso mejorando a la revalorización del oro, Los metales industriales que han estado, digamos, sufriendo, disminución de precio por cambios de su uso o incluso porque se atacaba esta cotización haciendo manipulación de mercado. Nosotros este año apostamos por el paladio como metal que puede dar bastante sorpresa, obviamente con su volatilidad. Seguimos apostando por el platino, seguimos apostando por el rodio y otros metales raros, ¿vale? Incluso metales que ya no son preciosos, en los cuales creo que va a haber una buena oportunidad de inversión a medio y a largo plazo, siempre a medio y a largo plazo.
Javier López Milán, CEO de Silver Gold Patrimonio, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros.
Gracias a vosotros.
Nos vamos directamente ahora a echar un vistazo a los mercados europeos, el cierre de Europa. Hoy un día maravilloso, hoy un día muy en verde. Ese dato estadounidense de inflación, buen dato de inflación, ha impulsado ya los mercados europeos. DAX-Etra, ojo, que ha terminado la jornada con una revalorización de un 1,6%, 20.590 puntos. CAC 40 arriba un 0,7%, 7.474 puntos. IBEX 35 termina la jornada por encima de los 11.900, acercándose ya a esos 12.000, 1,26% de revalorización intradía y el FTSE británico arriba un 1,2%. Dentro del selectivo español, el gran ganador de la jornada ha sido Celnex, con mucha diferencia, 7,6% arriba. Le sigue Merlin Properties, casi un 6% arriba y un 5,5% para Acciona y para Solaria. Por el otro lado, farolillo rojo de la jornada, CaixaBank, casi un 2% de corrección. Amadeus, 1% abajo. Y Bankinter se ha dejado medio punto porcentual en la jornada. Hoy también hemos estado muy pendientes de esos resultados de entidades, de fondos, de Citigroup, hemos estado hablando antes, de BlackRock, buenísimas cifras las que hemos visto hoy. Vamos a comentarlo en los próximos minutos. JP Morgan ganó, pues nada, un 18% más en 2024. BlackRock también, arriba un 16% más en 2024 que en 2023. BlackRock, JP Morgan, tenemos a Citigroup, también es como hemos conocido que sus ingresos en el cuarto trimestre aumentaron un 12%. Tenemos bastantes resultados, buenos resultados, que vamos a comentar en los siguientes minutos. También estamos muy pendientes, como todos los días, al final de ese acuerdo o posible acuerdo al que van a llegar Israel y Hamás, un acuerdo de alto el fuego que, como decíamos antes, podría peligrar porque dicen desde Israel Hamás estaría haciendo peticiones de último minuto relativos a unos mapas que no podría aceptar Israel. Ahora, en este momento, parece, pero esto con pinzas siempre, parece que este acuerdo ya se habría alcanzado, un acuerdo de alto el fuego entre Israel y Hamás en la zona de Gaza. Ahora, antes de continuar con noticias geopolíticas, vamos a hablar otra vez de bolsa, vamos a hablar de los mercados. Entrevistamos ya, saludamos en los próximos minutos, vamos a hablar con David Galán, el director de Bolsa General Asesores, pero antes, pequeñísima parada publicitaria. Ahora volvemos en pocos segundos.
Silver Gold Patrimonio nace en 2018 con el objetivo de innovar en el mercado de los metales preciosos de inversión, ofreciendo nuevas alternativas para que cualquier persona, familia o empresa pueda entrar en el fantástico mundo de los metales de inversión de forma sencilla y acompañada por consultores expertos en el sector. Silver Gold Patrimonio quiere avanzar contigo.
¿Puede privatizarse la democracia? Quizá es esa la pregunta que nos tenemos que hacer todos. Un globalismo que afecta a todo lo que sustenta nuestras vidas. Realidad económica tangible, necesaria de analizar. Esa necesidad de analizar el globalismo desde el punto de vista absolutamente económico, tangible y real.
Muy buenas, sabes que siempre hay algo oculto en la economía. Es lo que intento transmitirte en el libro Lo que la economía esconde, donde intento darte todas las pinceladas de un mundo geopolítico, económico, financiero, interrelacionado, entrelazado, en el que cada vez más el conocimiento de las claves de lo que circula alrededor de la información es casi tan importante como la noticia propia, de tal manera que en Lo que la economía esconde intento descifrarte, acompañarte, llevarte de la mano sobre distintos temas que sin duda van a ser clave en los próximos años, geopolíticos, financieros, bursátiles, y que sin duda van a marcar el camino de tus inversiones y de esa fotografía a medio y largo plazo cada vez más importante. Te animo a leer en esta entrada de 2025 Lo que la economía esconde. Buen día, buen negocio.
Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos de nuevo. Aquí seguimos en Negocios Televisión. Estamos muy pendientes, como decíamos, de esas negociaciones de alto el fuego. Tenemos noticia de última hora. Pronto se publicará una declaración conjunta, pero según la televisión Al Jazeera, se ha alcanzado un acuerdo de alto el fuego en Gaza. Se espera que la tercera fase de la negociación incluya la devolución de todos los cadáveres restantes, el comienzo de la reconstrucción de Gaza, que va a ser supervisada en este caso por Egipto, por Qatar y por la ONU. Las negociaciones sobre la segunda fase del acuerdo van a comenzar el día 16 de la fase 1 y se espera que incluyan la liberación de todos los rehenes restantes, incluidos soldados israelíes menores, un alto al fuego permanente y la retirada completa de los soldados israelíes. Repetimos, se alcanza finalmente un acuerdo de alto al fuego, informan varios medios, por ejemplo, Axios en Estados Unidos. Se ha alcanzado este acuerdo que incluye la liberación de rehenes, un alto al fuego entre Hamás y las fuerzas de defensa de Israel, según ha anunciado el periodista de Axios, Barak Ravid, citando a un funcionario estadounidense. Y en los próximos minutos vamos a echar un vistazo a las posibles sorpresas que pueda haber en el ámbito económico-financiero en 2025. Son posibles sorpresas 10, una lista que ha elaborado Bank of America. Vamos a comentarlo con José Antonio Belso, catedrático de Economía, director de Suma Gestión Tributaria. Muy buenas tardes.
Muy buenas tardes.
No sé si has dado tiempo a echar un vistazo a esta lista de Bank of America. Decían, por ejemplo, pues el SP espera retornos superiores al 20%. Decían también, hablan bien de los aranceles. Bueno, ¿qué nos puedes contar sobre esta lista de sorpresas que publica Bank of America?
Bueno, vamos a ver, al final Bank of America señala, bueno, pues una serie de escenarios que son bastante dinámicos, en general yo diría que ciertamente positivos. Uno, precisamente, y al hilo de la noticia que acabáis de dar en primicia, pues uno de los que pone encima de la mesa son los riesgos geopolíticos, que pueden introducir ciertas tensiones e inestabilidad en los mercados financieros. Obviamente, pues situaciones como la que se acaba de dar, pues le reducen estas tensiones, aunque bien es cierto que el escenario global pues todavía señala puntos, digamos, calientes que pues hacen que los mercados financieros puedan zozobrar. En conjunto, las perspectivas o que va señalando el Bank of America para la economía americana son ciertamente pues bastante positivas. Como decías, la apuesta trumpista por la reducción de los aranceles es bien recibida porque supone un incremento la actividad manufacturera y productiva en los Estados Unidos, con tirones al alza de los salarios, la apuesta también por la desregulación y la desburocratización puede suponer también un empujón para la eficiencia, que también redunde en una mayor inversión, en un mayor crecimiento de la economía norteamericana. También incluso algunas dinámicas en las cotizaciones de monedas como el yen pueden también apuntalar todavía vez más la balanza comercial de los Estados Unidos. Desde el punto de vista europeo, ciertamente, bueno, pues también lanzan algunos mensajes positivos, como es el caso de la política fiscal alemana, y en general europea, pero especialmente alemana, que puede tratar de suponer un aliento para una economía que está ciertamente no pasando por sus mejores momentos e impulsar inversiones críticas como pueden ser las en defensa y energéticas.
Los aranceles funcionan, dicen aquí desde Bank of America. Contrariamente a la creencia de que los aranceles son un impuesto ineficaz, Bank of America postula que la mano dura sobre países con grandes superávits comerciales podría estimular una mayor producción en Estados Unidos, apoyando empleo y aumentando salarios. Claro, de la inflación aquí no hablan mucho, parece.
Básicamente desde mi punto de vista, esos efectos de los aranceles de carácter tan positivo como señala el Bank of America, yo diría que son siempre vistos desde una perspectiva muy cortoplacista. Ciertamente tengo que ver que en un contexto más de carácter estructural a largo plazo, esos aranceles no van a redundar en una pérdida de eficiencia global de la economía norteamericana. Yo creo que para eso necesitamos algo más de recorrido. En lo que respecta a los tipos de interés, pues sí que es cierto que, bueno, pues se apuesta por un cierto agotamiento en lo que respecta a la deuda pública y una cierta tendencia por parte de los inversores a buscar alternativas a esos bonos que financian los desequilibrios presupuestarios de la economía norteamericana. Incluso resulta sorpresivo, pues, como han puntualizado el caso de un cierto estancamiento y agotamiento de la inversión en la inteligencia artificial, que viene siendo la estrella en los últimos años, y eso pues quizás llevaría a muchos inversores a plantearse la diversificación de sus carteras y buscar inversiones alternativas que apuntalen, digamos, pues esa pérdida de atractivo que esperan para la inteligencia artificial, básicamente por falta de disponibilidad de datos que continúen con el entrenamiento de la inteligencia.
También veo aquí, decías antes, fortaleza del yen, efectivamente, que puede pesar sobre las acciones de crecimiento en Estados Unidos, eurozona que se libera de restricciones fiscales, también desbloqueos de gastos de capital mediante desregulación y eficiencia gubernamental. ¿A qué se refieren con esto?
Pues básicamente que hay una apuesta por parte del gobierno norteamericano de reducir y facilitar los trámites. Esa facilitación de los trámites al final lo que hace es acelerar cualquier actuación, pues, de apertura de nuevos comercios, de inversiones en ciertos sectores productivos, y gracias a esas nuevas inversiones pues se puedan realizar cambios tecnológicos, renovaciones de equipos productivos que redunden en una mayor productividad por hora y por tanto permitan una mejora salarial de los trabajadores que impulse la demanda. De hecho, ya en el mes de diciembre, el mismo Bank of America señalaba que el consumo iba a ser uno de los elementos atractivos. Las empresas de consumo iban a ser uno de los sectores atractivos para la inversión en el año 2025.
También hablan de la inteligencia artificial. 2024 ha sido claramente el año de la IA. Parece que 2025 puede seguir siéndolo.
Bueno, ahí si una lectura detenida del informe señala que hay un cierto agotamiento en la disponibilidad de datos para seguir entrenando las herramientas de inteligencia artificial. Yo creo que puede ser, es un escenario bastante verosímil que nos encontremos que ya se haya, digamos, tirado de aquellos datos que están más estructurados, que son más accesibles y que son más procesables por esta tecnología, y estemos llegando al final del camino de esos datos que son muy accesibles. Nos vamos a encontrar con una frontera donde la disponibilidad de datos va a ser cada vez menor, donde incluso las políticas altamente proteccionistas de acceso a datos pueden dificultar el acceso de las empresas y de las herramientas de inteligencia artificial a esos nuevos datos que aceleren todavía más su aprendizaje. Y bueno, pues por ese lado puede haber un cierto agotamiento si no se encuentran esos nuevos caladeros de información que permitan seguir encontrando. Pero seguro, y eso, bueno, es que quizás estoy tirándome un poco a la piscina, seguro que las empresas harán unos esfuerzos y encontrarán esos caladeros de nueva información que les permitan seguir entrenando sus herramientas. Yo eso tengo mis dudas a que haya ese parón en la evolución de lo que es la inteligencia artificial.
Pues con esto nos vamos a quedar, con estas 10 posibles sorpresas para este 2025. José Antonio Belso, catedrático de Economía, director de Suma Gestión Tributaria. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a vosotros.
Y hasta aquí esta segunda hora de Rolling Stocks. Se quedan ahora con las noticias, que hay muchas de última hora, y muy pendientes de ese posible acuerdo entre Israel y Gaza, aquí en Negocios Televisión.
Milito y Cecilia Peña lo están petando en redes sociales. Contadnos qué es Viking Speed y Nice Green.
Tú eres súper fan nuestro, bien lo sabes. Mira, ya tenemos distribuidores en Japón, Noruega, Suecia. Yo alucino cuando veo mi producto japonés o noruego o búlgaro. Pero es que eso es poco. Además, mira,
Próximamente en Colombia.
¿Colombia?
Sí, nos vamos a América.
A hacer las Américas. Pero cuéntanos, Ceci, ¿qué es Viking Speed?
Javi, tú que eres fan, sabes perfectamente que en Internet está toda la información para todo el público.
Pues efectivamente soy súper fan de Viking Speed y Nice Green. A mí me soluciona la vida porque me vale para todo.
Bueno, para todo no vale.
¿Para qué no vale, Milito?
Oye, mira, por ejemplo, para peinarse. Mira qué pelo trae.
¿Las soluciones de inversión tradicionales ya no cumplen con sus objetivos financieros? ¿La escasa rentabilidad y la volatilidad de los mercados le empujan a mantener los ahorros en su cuenta corriente? Si la respuesta a ambas preguntas es afirmativa, lo más probable es que esté pensando que la opción de no invertir es la óptima. Esta alternativa es quizás la más inmediata, pero ciertamente no parece la más rentable. Nuestros productos de generación de rentas están diseñados para ofrecerle el equilibrio adecuado entre seguridad y rentabilidad, con el fin de aprovechar todas las oportunidades del mercado. Hemos revisado nuestro enfoque tradicional, ampliando el espectro de oportunidades dentro del segmento de rentas para una inversión que le prepare mejor para el futuro. Y con la integración de los principios ESG, podemos ayudar a construir un futuro más verde para todos los inversores que buscan rentabilidad. No se conforme con la liquidez. Prepárese para el futuro con fondos de Invesco. Descubra más en invesco.es/income.
¿Te preocupa que tu inquilino no pague el alquiler? Sabemos que esto puede ser un desafío. Aunque los gastos son fáciles de calcular, el verdadero reto es gestionar la falta de pago por parte del inquilino. SEAC te ofrece una garantía de renta asegurada hasta que recuperes tu vivienda, pase el tiempo que pase. Relájate. SEAC se encarga de todo. Alquila tranquilo. SEAC responde.
Vosotros estabais hace una semana liando a la parda. Y ahora, no, ahora hay que sobrevivir 4 años.
Fomentarla ni la van a fomentar.
Se comenta con bastante alegría.
¿Qué estás diciendo sobre el gobierno?
Resistir y resistir y resistir.
Y hay bastante fake news y bastantes rumores falsos.
No todo es chorrada climática. Eso lleva a la deuda pública española a una situación de insostenibilidad. Deja de gastar.
Siempre dicen que voy a empezar una guerra. No voy a empezar una guerra.
¿Quién va? Yo no voy, yo no voy.
Se habrá sorprendido de lo bien que lo hacíamos ya, ¿no?
Que todos los diputados que están en el Congreso en este momento, todos, no ocultéis el malestar brutal de la población. ¿Y qué pasa a partir de ahora?
Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos de nuevo a Negocios Televisión, bienvenidos al espacio de las noticias del día, pendientes ya de la última hora, mirando a Oriente Medio, este posible acuerdo entre Israel y Hamás, pendientes también de la alerta de Polonia, del órdago, de Vladimir Putin a Donald Trump, mirando por supuesto a la OTAN, que habla de que está en juego el futuro de seguridad de todos los aliados, y también pendientes de Ucrania, que extiende la ley marcial después de que hoy haya sufrido un nuevo ataque masivo por parte de Rusia. Enseguida miramos a estas cuestiones, pero empezamos hablando de últimas horas, y es que, según empiezan a apuntar varios medios, habría alcanzado un acuerdo de alto el fuego que incluye la liberación de rehenes y el alto el fuego entre Hamás y las fuerzas de defensa de Israel. El acuerdo establece un periodo inicial de alto el fuego de 6 semanas, durante el cual las tropas israelíes iniciarán una retirada gradual. Este proceso también incluye la liberación de los rehenes que Hamás mantiene en su poder a cambio de la liberación de los prisioneros palestinos detenidos por Israel. Antes, el líder del grupo entregó la aprobación del acuerdo de este alto el fuego a los mediadores en Doha. Empezamos a conocer más detalles precisamente de este acuerdo. Al parecer establece una fase inicial de alto el fuego de 6 semanas, incluye la retirada gradual de las fuerzas israelíes del centro de Gaza y también regreso de los palestinos desplazados al norte de la franja de Gaza. El segundo acuerdo, la segunda fase de este acuerdo, según empiezan a contar algunos medios, incluiría en este caso el día 16, en la fase 1, se espera que incluya la liberación de todos los rehenes restantes, incluidos los soldados israelíes menores, un alto el fuego permanente y la retirada completa de los soldados israelíes. Está a punto de comparecer el primer ministro de Qatar contando todos los detalles, como decimos, de este acuerdo de alto el fuego que al parecer se habría alcanzado finalmente entre Israel y Hamás. Sobre este acuerdo hablaba el secretario general de la ONU, Antonio Guterres, habla de esperanza, de un momento esperanzador para Oriente Medio. Lo escuchamos.
Comprensible que uno esté abrumado por la conmoción de nuestro mundo. Pero de cara al año que empieza no debemos perder de vista los avances y su potencial. Y hay atisbos de esperanza. Los negociadores se hallan en las etapas finales de un alto al fuego y liberación de rehenes en Gaza. Entre tanto, el fuego en el Líbano se mantiene mayormente y el país pudo finalmente elegir a un presidente después de 2 años de estancamiento.
Y mientras tanto, los hutíes han comunicado este miércoles que llevaron a cabo una operación militar conjunta contra el portaaviones estadounidense US Harry Truman y varios buques de guerra que lo acompañaban en el norte del Mar Rojo. Según el comunicado, el ataque se produjo mientras el portaaviones estadounidense intentaba llevar a cabo operaciones contra Yemen. El texto añade que en la ofensiva se utilizaron misiles de crucero y drones militares. Asimismo, los hutíes prometieron que no detendrán sus operaciones hasta que cese la guerra en la franja de Gaza y se levante el bloqueo del enclave palestino. Se trata de la 6ª vez que el US Harry Truman es atacado desde que entró en aguas del Mar Rojo. También miramos a Corea del Sur, Japón y Estados Unidos, que han realizado este miércoles ejercicios aéreos conjuntos en los que participó al menos un bombardero B-1B, siendo las primeras maniobras trilaterales que llevan a cabo en el presente año, es lo que informa la agencia Yonhap, citando al Ministerio de Defensa surcoreano. Dice que Corea del Sur, Estados Unidos y Japón reforzarán la cooperación para disuadir conjuntamente las amenazas de la República Popular Democrática de Corea y responder a ellas mientras amplían continuamente los simulacros trilaterales basados en una estrecha cooperación. Asimismo, indica que las fuerzas aéreas surcoreana y estadounidense realizaron esta misma jornada por separado su primer ejercicio aéreo combinado con fuego real de 2025 en un esfuerzo por reforzar su postura de defensa conjunta. Mientras tanto, la Armada de India ha lanzado este miércoles un submarino, un destructor y una fragata, lo que representa un compromiso militar considerable por parte del aliado de Estados Unidos con armas nucleares y subraya el enfoque de la nación en salvaguardar la región del Océano Índico. Los lanzamientos navales simultáneos de la India resaltan su enfoque estratégico en contrarrestar los desafíos en el Océano Índico, una ruta marítima crucial a través de la cual fluye el 95% de su comercio en medio de la creciente presencia naval de China en estas aguas. El analista de defensa Rahul Bedi señalaba que el INS Bagsir, el sexto de la serie de submarinos diésel eléctricos convencionales de la clase Scorpion de diseño francés, tiene como objetivo reemplazar las antiguas plataformas submarinas de la India y al mismo tiempo abordar brechas críticas de capacidad. Con la incorporación de India ya opera una flota de 16 submarinos, reforzando su postura de defensa en la región. Miramos ahora a Francia. El primer ministro francés, François Bayrou, ha abierto la puerta a la renegociación de la controvertida reforma de las pensiones en un intento de ganarse el apoyo de los legisladores de izquierda que necesita para aprobar el presupuesto de 2025. La concesión de Bayrou subrayó la magnitud de la agitación política de Francia mientras se preparaba para pasar sus primeras semanas en el cargo, elaborando la reforma de pensiones de 2023 bajo la presión de la izquierda que amenaza con derrocar a su gobierno de lo contrario. Mientras tanto, mirando también a la OTAN, les contamos que un petrolero ruso incautado por las autoridades alemanas la semana pasada en el mar Báltico sigue en aguas alemanas y se está llevando a cabo una evaluación aduanera, es lo que apunta este miércoles en Berlín un portavoz del gobierno. En concreto, el petrolero de 274 metros de eslora y bandera panameña llamado Eventin fue detenido el viernes cuando se encontraba a la deriva y no podía maniobrar con 90.000 toneladas métricas de petróleo a bordo, es lo que apunta el Mando Central de Emergencias Marítimas de Alemania. También miramos a la OTAN con declaraciones por parte de su secretario general. Los países de la OTAN van a desplegar fragatas, aviones de patrulla y drones navales en el mar Báltico para ayudar a proteger infraestructura crítica y reservarse el derecho a tomar medidas contra barcos sospechosos de representar una amenaza a la seguridad. Es lo que apuntaban los miembros de la alianza. Están tomando esta medida denominada Centinela del Báltico después de una serie de incidentes en los que se dañaron cables eléctricos, enlaces de telecomunicaciones y gasoductos a raíz del conflicto en Ucrania. El mes pasado la policía finlandesa confiscó un petrolero que transportaba petróleo ruso y dijo que sospechaba que el buque había dañado la línea eléctrica finlandesa Estonia Slink 2, además de 4 cables de telecomunicaciones. El presidente finlandés, Alexander Stubb, dijo que los daños del 25 de diciembre estaban definitivamente relacionados con Rusia.
Today, I can announce that NATO is launching Baltic Sentry. Under the authority of NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, General Kishkavoli, this military activity is part of our ongoing effort to enhance maritime presence and monitoring of key areas for our alliance. It will involve a range of assets, including frigates and maritime patrol aircraft, among others, and will enhance our vigilance in the Baltic. Second, we have agreed today to launch an initiative to deploy new technologies to this effort, including a small fleet of naval drones to provide enhanced surveillance and deterrence.
Mirando a la OTAN, les contamos que el primer ministro polaco Donald Tusk ha asegurado en las últimas horas, este miércoles, que Rusia planeó actos terroristas contra aerolíneas de todo el mundo, acusando a Moscú de organizar sabotajes y secuestros de aviones. Esta es la alerta por parte de Donald Tusk.
Сила в всьому цивілізованому світі, не тільки України, вони вимагають також спільних дій, і Польща відіграє ключову роль щодо проти тих саботажу і диверсії, яка має місце не тільки на польській території. Росія деякі акти саботажу чи підготування до диверсії були в країнах дуже драматичних. Останні інформації можу тільки підтвердити. Росія планувала повітряний терор, і то не тільки проти Польщі, але також проти авіаліній на цілому світі.
Decía Tusk que esto todo es todo lo que puede decir, que no puede entrar en detalles, pero afirmaba que puede confirmar la validez de estos temores, que Rusia ha estado planeando actos terroristas aéreos y no solo contra Polonia, sino contra aerolíneas de todo el mundo. Es lo que apuntaba Tusk a los periodistas en Varsovia. Seguimos mirando a la OTAN. A su secretario general, Mark Rutte, afirmaba este miércoles que Rusia intenta debilitar las democracias y mermar la libertad de los aliados y que tiene apoyo de China, Corea del Norte e Irán. Decía que Rusia se esfuerza por debilitar las democracias y mermar la libertad. Es lo que apuntaba Rutte en una intervención ante los jefes de Estado Mayor de la defensa de los países de la alianza que se reúnen hoy y mañana en Bruselas. Rutte habla de prevenir una guerra.
To prevent war, we need to prepare for it. It's time to shift to a wartime mindset. And this means we need to make our defenses even stronger by spending more on defense, producing more and better defense capabilities. We need to support Ukraine more to change the trajectory of the war. We all want it to end, but above all, we want a peace to last.
Ahora, Canadá, el ministro de Energía canadiense Jonathan Wilkinson ha dicho este miércoles que están abiertos a aumentar el comercio y a intensificar asociaciones industriales con Estados Unidos después de que el presidente electo Donald Trump amenazara al país con aranceles. Wilkinson dijo a Financial Times que Canadá podría comprar equipo militar estadounidense, incluidos submarinos, y cooperar con Estados Unidos en la extracción de minerales críticos. Insistía en que el mayor desafío para su país proviene de China, que tiene el control estratégico de una serie de activos diferentes, incluidas materias primas críticas, pidiendo a Estados Unidos que se centre en una alianza o asociación en materia de seguridad energética y minera con Canadá. Sin embargo, también advirtió que su gobierno podría imponer aranceles de represalia a los productos estadounidenses que podrían causar la mayor cantidad de angustia en Estados Unidos y el menor dolor en Canadá. También miramos a Groenlandia. Advierte a Donald Trump. Dice que la intención del presidente electo de Estados Unidos podría producir un efecto devastador para la isla ante los inversores internacionales. Es lo que afirma la ministra de Comercio, Recursos Minerales, Justicia e Igualdad de Género groenlandesa en una entrevista con Financial Times. Decía, cuando Trump habló de no excluir el uso militar en Groenlandia, me preocupé bastante por cómo los inversores percibirían a Groenlandia, tal vez como una democracia a punto de volverse inestable o invadida. Eso sería devastador para nuestro sector minero, porque a los inversores no les gusta la inestabilidad. Al mismo tiempo, la ministra observaba que las palabras del presidente entrante podrían ser interpretadas de otra manera. Dice, si dejamos de lado la retórica, lo que oigo decir a Trump es que cree que se deben aprovechar los recursos naturales de Groenlandia y estamos totalmente de acuerdo con él. Mirando a los elegidos de Donald Trump, les contamos que el senador estadounidense de Florida y candidato del presidente electo para secretario de Estado, Marco Rubio, ha dicho este miércoles en su audiencia de confirmación que el orden global posterior a la Segunda Guerra Mundial es obsoleto y está siendo utilizado como un arma contra Estados Unidos. Un Marco Rubio que ha tenido que vivir este momento, una nueva interrupción a uno de los elegidos de Donald Trump.
Second World War, the United States was, in the words of then Secretary of State, tasked with creating an order, a world order, a free half, as he quote in his quote, out of chaos, without blowing to pieces, without blowing the whole of the world into pieces in the process. And in the decades that followed, that global order served us quite well. Americans' incomes rose and communities flourished. Alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and Europe that led to the emergence of stability and democracy and prosperity in these regions.
We've had forever war ever since. Little Marco, keep your hands.
Back to order. All right, alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe that led to the emergence of stability, democracy, and prosperity, but it also prevented a cataclysmic world war. And ultimately, a wall in Berlin came down.
Rubio destacaba la necesidad de crear un mundo libre a partir del caos y agregó que eso no será posible sin unos Estados Unidos fuertes y confiados que pongan sus intereses nacionales por encima de todo. Al mismo tiempo, señalaba que la política exterior de Estados Unidos debería seguir un rumbo más realista, priorizando los intereses de los estadounidenses por encima de la promoción de la causa de la paz en la tierra. El Precisamente el senador Marco Rubio ha dicho este miércoles que tanto Rusia como Ucrania tendrán que hacer concesiones para poner fin a la guerra en Ucrania. Decía, va a ser un trabajo duro, es lo que apuntaba en su audiencia de confirmación ante el Comité de Relaciones Exteriores del Senado. Añadía que se esperaba que se pudiera lograr un alto el fuego en el conflicto. Esta guerra tiene que terminar, es lo que decía, mientras añadía que para eso va a requerir una diplomacia audaz. Les contamos además que las agencias de seguridad nacional de Estados Unidos advierten que la toma de posesión de Donald Trump será un objetivo potencial atractivo para extremistas violentos, aunque afirman que no hay amenazas creíbles específicas. Los posibles perpetradores, particularmente aquellos con quejas relacionadas con las elecciones, pueden ver la juramentación de Trump como su última oportunidad de influir en los resultados de las elecciones a través de la violencia, lo que escribía un grupo de agencias de inteligencia y de aplicación de la ley en una evaluación de amenazas. Las preocupaciones de las agencias reflejan el ambiente político intensificado en el que Trump asumirá el poder. Precisamente les contamos que la próxima administración de Estados Unidos de Donald Trump aumentará el volumen de suministros de armas y equipos militares a Taiwán. Es lo que afirma este martes el congresista Mike Waltz, futuro asesor de seguridad de Estados Unidos. Aseveraba que en algunas cuestiones de la política exterior van a seguir los pasos de la administración de Biden, como por ejemplo en las relaciones con Taiwán. Decía, tenemos un atraso de más de 20.000 millones de dólares en cosas que ellos han pagado y tenemos que trabajar muy duro para dejar libres y hacer que reciban lo que pagaron como medida de disuasión a China. Así comentaba la situación en torno a la isla, que dice que seguirá convirtiéndose en una especie de puercoespín. Los asesores de Donald Trump, que ahora admiten que la guerra en Ucrania tardará meses o incluso más en resolverse, un duro golpe de realidad para su mayor promesa política exterior. Alcanzar un acuerdo de paz en su primer día en la Casa Blanca no va a ser posible. Dos colaboradores de Trump que han discutido la guerra en Ucrania con el presidente electo decían que consideran un cronograma de meses para resolver este conflicto. Describían las promesas de Trump como una combinación de fanfarronería de campaña y una falta de apreciación de la intratabilidad de este conflicto, al tiempo, además, que dicen que es costoso llevar a cabo personal para una nueva administración. Mientras tanto, el primer ministro de Hungría, Viktor Orbán, no asistirá a la investidura del presidente estadounidense Donald Trump el 20 de enero por cuestiones de agendas, lo que avanzaba su jefe de prensa, Bertalan Havasi, al diario digital Telex. En lugar de viajar a Washington para participar en la ceremonia de toma de posesión de su aliado Trump, Orbán va a presentar el mismo día en Budapest los resultados de la presidencia rotatoria de la Unión Europea que ocupó su país en el segundo semestre de 2024. De momento se desconoce si el gobierno húngaro estará representado por un enviado de Orbán en el acto al que ha sido invitado junto a otros líderes políticos. Miramos también al órdago de Putin, y es que Rusia va a exigir que Ucrania reduzca drásticamente sus lazos militares con la OTAN y se convierta en un estado neutral, con un ejército limitado, en cualquier conversación con el presidente electo de Estados Unidos, Donald Trump. Es lo que apunta la agencia Bloomberg, cada vez más seguro de que tiene la ventaja en el campo de batalla en Ucrania. El presidente ruso, Vladimir Putin, está decidido a lograr su objetivo de que Kiev nunca se una a la OTAN y que se pongan límites a su capacidad militar. Precisamente seguimos mirando a Rusia, que ha empleado más de 40 misiles y unos 70 drones en su ataque de esta madrugada contra Ucrania. Ha caído dirigido sobre todo contra infraestructuras y contra el sistema energético, es lo que informa el presidente ucraniano, Volodymyr Zelensky, en sus redes sociales. Ha explicado que al menos 30 de esos misiles han sido destruidos por las defensas ucranianas. Decía que han sufrido otro ataque masivo de Estados Unidos. Decía, estamos en mitad del invierno y el objetivo para los rusos sigue siendo el mismo, nuestro sistema de energía. Agrega que entre los blancos hay infraestructuras gasísticas. Precisamente Rusia y Ucrania han realizado este miércoles el primer canje de prisioneros desde el inicio del nuevo año según la fórmula 25 por 25. Según el Ministerio de Defensa ruso, como resultado del proceso de negociaciones, 25 militares rusos fueron recuperados del territorio controlado por Kiev. A cambio fueron trasladados 25 prisioneros de guerra de las Fuerzas Armadas de Ucrania. A continuación, la cartera detalló que todos los militares rusos se encuentran en el territorio de la República de Bielorrusia, donde se les proporcionará asistencia psicológica y médica necesaria, así como también la opción de comunicarse con sus familiares. Miramos ahora a Ucrania, y es que la prohibición de Zelensky de negociar con los dirigentes rusos sigue vigente, es lo que afirma el ministro de Asuntos Exteriores de Ucrania, Andrei Sybiga, en una entrevista a medios locales publicada este miércoles, respondiendo a una pregunta sobre las posibles negociaciones con Rusia. Sibiga aclaró que por el momento no se ha planteado la cuestión de las conversaciones con Moscú en ningún formato. Decía, a día de hoy, esta decisión del Consejo de Seguridad Nacional y Defensa de Ucrania es válida, es lo que asevera el político. En este contexto, Sibiga sostuvo que Kiev todavía espera a que se establezcan los contactos oficiales con la administración entrante del presidente electo de Estados Unidos, Donald Trump, para discutir los siguientes pasos hacia una posible solución del conflicto. Les contamos además que la Rada Suprema, el Parlamento Unicameral de Ucrania, ha avalado este miércoles la petición del presidente Volodymyr Zelensky de extender otros 3 meses más los decretos de ley marcial y movilización general emitidos tras el inicio del conflicto. Zelensky había presentado en la víspera la petición formal de esta prórroga y el trámite se ha cubierto sin contratiempos, como anunciaba en Telegram el diputado Yaroslav Selesniak. En el caso de la ley marcial, 315 legisladores han votado a favor, mientras que el decreto de movilización ha recibido 310 apoyos. El Parlamento tiene un total de 450 escaños. Las medidas entrarán en vigor, por tanto, hasta el próximo 9 de mayo. Y terminamos mirando a un Zelensky que ha firmado este miércoles una ley que obliga a los jóvenes de 17 años a inscribirse en el registro de reclutamiento en Ucrania. Zelensky firmó la ley 4197/9, según la cual cada año, del 1 de enero al 31 de julio, los jóvenes que cumplen 17 años son inscritos como reclutas y se inscriben los datos en el registro estatal unificado de reclutas, personas susceptibles de cumplir el servicio militar y reservistas, es lo que comunica la Rada Suprema de Ucrania. Según el organismo, los jóvenes se someten a un reconocimiento médico antes de realizar las prácticas de formación militar general básica. El proyecto de ley también amplía hasta el 1 de marzo la opción de que los ausentes sin permiso regresen voluntariamente a las Fuerzas Armadas de Ucrania. Pendientes de la última hora, mirando también al mejor análisis, todo lo que acontece en directo. Ven ustedes en sus pantallas manifestaciones, los familiares de los rehenes. Se habla de una victoria en Israel, sobre todo para estas familias después de 15 meses de guerra, después de 15 meses de conflicto. Se habla de un acuerdo, un alto el fuego entre Israel y Hamás. Hacemos una pausa y enseguida el mejor análisis en Negocios Televisión.
¿Qué cuento quieres hoy? ¿Te cuento uno de los míos? ¿El del farmacéutico? ¿O el de María, la abogada?
El de Ana, la arquitecta.
Vale. Eras una niña que soñaba con crear los edificios más impresionantes de la Tierra. Se pasaba el día dibujándolos. Sabía que algún día acabarían llegando a lo más alto de cada ciudad. Y que cualquier persona...
Cada profesional tiene detrás una historia increíble. Creer en ella es lo que de verdad cuenta. Arquia Banca, el banco de los profesionales.
Silver Gold Patrimonio nace en 2018 con el objetivo de innovar en el mercado de los metales preciosos de inversión, ofreciendo nuevas alternativas para que cualquier persona, familia o empresa pueda entrar en el fantástico mundo de los metales de inversión de forma sencilla y acompañada por consultores expertos en el sector. Silver Gold Patrimonio quiere avanzar contigo.
Muy buenas, sabes que siempre hay algo oculto en la economía. Es lo que intento transmitirte en el libro Lo que la economía esconde, donde intento darte todas las pinceladas de un mundo geopolítico, económico, financiero, interrelacionado, entrelazado, en el que cada vez más el conocimiento de las claves de lo que circula alrededor de la información es casi tan importante como la noticia propia, de tal manera que en Lo que la economía esconde intento descifrarte, acompañarte, llevarte de la mano sobre distintos temas que sin duda van a ser clave en los próximos años, geopolíticos, financieros, bursátiles, y que sin duda van a marcar el camino de tus inversiones y de esa fotografía a medio y largo plazo cada vez más importante. Te animo a leer en esta entrada de 2025 Lo que la economía esconde. Buen día, buen negocio.
Y seguimos en Negocios Televisión, pendientes de la última hora, mirando a la imagen que ven en sus pantallas pendientes de Tel Aviv. Les contábamos que se ha alcanzado un alto el fuego, un acuerdo que incluye el intercambio de rehenes entre Hamas y las FDI. El acuerdo establece un periodo inicial de alto el fuego de 6 semanas, durante el cual las tropas israelíes iniciarán una retirada gradual hacia los límites del enclave. Este proceso también implica la liberación de los rehenes que Hamas tiene actualmente en poder a cambio de la liberación de los prisioneros palestinos detenidos por Israel. Se afirma que Israel tiene previsto liberar a 30 detenidos palestinos a cambio de cada rehén civil y 50 por cada mujer soldado. El acuerdo también establece que se deben transportar a Gaza 600 camiones cargados de ayuda humanitaria cada día que esté en vigor este alto el fuego. El líder del grupo, Jalil Al-Haya, había entregado a los mediadores en Doha la aprobación del acuerdo de alto el fuego. El acuerdo pondría fin a una guerra de 15 meses que comenzó el 7 de octubre de 2023. Ha muerto hasta 46.700 habitantes en Gaza. Esta es la imagen en estos momentos en Tel Aviv. Las familias de los rehenes se manifiestan. Los escuchamos. Esta es la imagen en estos momentos, los familiares de los rehenes manifestándose en Tel Aviv ante este anuncio, este acuerdo de alto el fuego entre Israel y Hamas. Tenemos ya la reacción del presidente electo de Estados Unidos. Donald Trump acaba de anunciar este miércoles que se ha alcanzado un alto el fuego en Gaza. Añade que los rehenes serán liberados en breve. Decía, tenemos un acuerdo para los rehenes en Oriente Medio, es lo que aclaraba en un post publicado en Truth Social. Previamente había advertido que se desataría el infierno en Oriente Medio, a menos que los rehenes retenidos por Hamas en Gaza no fueran liberados antes de su investidura el 20 de enero. Este miércoles, se lo contábamos hace apenas unos minutos, se informaba que Hamas y Israel acordaron firmar un acuerdo de alto el fuego y toma de rehenes en Gaza que pondría fin al conflicto que comenzó el 7 de octubre de 2023. Trump dice que va a trabajar con Israel y sus aliados para asegurarse de que Gaza nunca se convierta en un refugio seguro para terroristas. Dice además que va a construir y expandir aún más los acuerdos de Abraham. Es la última hora en estos momentos la reacción de Donald Trump ante este acuerdo de alto el fuego en Gaza. Vemos que hay mucha prisa por ponerse medallas, tanto por parte de Trump como por parte de Joe Biden. Vamos a analizar esta última hora, este acuerdo de alto el fuego en Gaza, pendientes también de la tensión en Ucrania, como siempre, con los mejores expertos, y contamos con Diego Pitars, profesor de Relaciones Internacionales en el IEB, que está con nosotros en Negocios Televisión. ¿Qué tal, Diego? Muy buenas tardes.
¿Qué tal? Muy buenas tardes, Según. ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, encantados de tenerte por aquí, encantados también de contar esta a priori buena noticia, este acuerdo de alto el fuego en Gaza. Veíamos ya la reacción de Donald Trump, veíamos también la reacción de los familiares de los rehenes, que no están del todo contentos, nunca lleva a gusto de todos. Diego, te quiero preguntar por esto, ¿qué supone este alto el fuego y sobre todo si tiene visos de durar, si es una buena noticia o si es un parche, para entendernos?
Bien, bueno, la verdad es que como parche, yo creo que sí que es un poquito parche, pero desde luego la noticia no es buena, es fantástica, ¿no? Al fin y al cabo es algo que ya se lleva anunciando unos días. Sí que es verdad que no sabemos ninguno cuáles son el acuerdo exacto al que van a llegar o quieren llegar, pero desde luego partir de la base de la liberación de rehenes, sobre todo por la parte de Hamás, que al fin y al cabo nadie sabe cuántos había, y eso para mí creo que va a ser uno de las espinitas que va a tener, que habrá una lista creada obviamente por Israel, y no sé, y me temo desgraciadamente, que no el 100% de esos rehenes van a poder volver a casa. Quizás eso también sea una de las consecuencias de estas manifestaciones, ¿no? Los queremos a todos, pero no sabemos si volverán todos, desgraciadamente. Hay un comentario que has hecho que me parece fantástico y es verdad. O sea, tanto Biden como Trump están corriendo a ver quién se hace la foto primero y quién se cuelga la medalla antes, ¿no? Lo comentaba el otro día, este anuncio y estas prisas y estas, bueno, corre, era un poquito, quizás sea también un poquito para tener un titular para Joe Biden antes de dejar ya la Casa Blanca, ¿no? Que realmente le queda, pues mira, hoy es día 15, pues 5 días le queda de inquilino. Estará, me imagino, con todas las cajas ya preparadas. Pero, desde luego, es triste que por una noticia de estas, pues efectivamente, estos estén un poquito corriendo a ver quién es el que se hace la primera foto. Como noticia, buenísima. Completa, ya veremos. ¿Se convertiría en una forma de rearme quizás de Hamás a medio plazo? Pues no las tengo todas conmigo, pero sí que es un conflicto, y esto yo ya lo comenté hace unos cuantos meses, que no es de ahora, o sea, es un conflicto que tiene cientos, miles de años, ¿no? Podríamos decir casi, pero que ahí está y bueno, todo, como he dicho, un parche, bueno, sea parche o no sea parche, desde luego, buena noticia es, eso es lo que yo creo que nos tenemos que congratular hoy todos.
Desde luego que nos quedamos con eso, Diego, pero como bien estabas contando, parece que hay mucha prisa por hacerse la foto, por ponerse esta medalla. Es cierto que coincide con los últimos días de Joe Biden en el cargo, es cierto además que coincide prácticamente, ¿no?, con la toma del poder de Donald Trump. ¿Quién tiene el mérito de estas negociaciones, Diego? Porque hay muchos que dicen, no, es que el impulsor de esto es Donald Trump, que Netanyahu quiere estar cerca de él. Hay otros que dicen, no, es que Biden, como se va, está apretando. ¿Quién tiene el mérito? Más allá de la noticia, así que, como estamos diciendo, es muy positiva, claro.
Bueno, el mérito yo creo que aquí es un poco repartido. Quizás el mérito podemos decir que es de los dos, no voy a negarlo. Tampoco es cuestión de ser salomónico, un poco gallego, puede que sí, puede que no. No, yo creo que aquí sí que es verdad que Biden es pues un poco el impulsor de estas prisas, de que sea un poco más acelerado. Al final es un poquito todos, ¿no? Biden lo ha acelerado un poquito porque tampoco quería, en cierta medida, que es lo triste nuevamente, ¿no?, que tengamos que recorrer un tema político, no querría que fuera Trump el que se colgara esta medalla, porque además Trump ya lo lleva anunciando mucho tiempo, esto hay que ponerle fin, y bueno, pues Biden dijo, pues lo voy a poner fin, porque así por lo menos alguien se queda con un poquito de buen sabor de boca. Netanyahu, obviamente, independientemente que sea Biden o sea Trump, le interesa seguir llevándose bien con Estados Unidos, no lo podemos negar. Es su hermano mayor, con lo cual siempre van a estar ahí vigilándose y cuidándose uno del otro. Por eso digo, quizás Trump, desde que anunció que iba a participar en este acuerdo de paz, más que de paz, de alto al fuego, pues Biden quizás le haya entrado un poquito más las prisas, con lo cual podemos decir que uno es el que hizo quizás de starter, ¿verdad?, de arrancar esto, pero no podemos negarle, obviamente, a Biden, te que haga mejor o te que haga peor, eso ya es lo de menos, que ha sido un poquito el que ha acelerado que esto se pueda dar. Este acelerón de último momento, hay una cosa que a mí me preocupa y es si realmente quizás la consecuencia es lo que comentabas antes, ¿no? El parche. Quizás no se hayan mirado todos los puntos exactamente, aunque lleven semanas negociando este alto el fuego, pero quizás las prisas muchas veces pues no son buenas compañeras. Entonces ya veremos si está un poquito cogido con pinzas o si realmente va a ser prolongado este alto el fuego, que esperemos que así sea.
¿Qué sucede con este alto el fuego? Mientras ya estamos pensando en el siguiente, Diego, ya estamos pensando en qué va a pasar con Ucrania. Hoy se filtraba que asesores de Donald Trump hablan de meses para solucionar este conflicto, hablan de fanfarronería por parte del presidente electo de Estados Unidos, mientras que hoy hemos conocido que Putin le lanza un órdago. Dice que Ucrania nunca puede entrar en la OTAN, nada de 20, de 25 años, nada de congelación del conflicto. Si se quiere resolver esto, Putin quiere que Ucrania no pueda entrar nunca en la OTAN. ¿Crees que esto se va a poder negociar? ¿Crees que esto va a poder ser asumido por parte de Donald Trump?
Bueno, al final en cualquier negociación siempre empieza a ser como cuando vas a un mercado árabe y te ponen el precio más alto. ¿Para qué? Para que tú negocies, básicamente. Entonces yo creo que es un poquito, más que un órdago, es una oferta encima de la mesa que no es como la del padrino, que no podrá rechazar. Esta se podrá rechazar y se negociará seguramente pues un menor tiempo para poder entrar dentro de la OTAN. Sí que hay que tener en cuenta que desde luego Minsk y luego esa ratificación, Minsk II, el acuerdo era que no entraría en la OTAN. Ahora, bueno, una cesión, una concesión dentro de 40 años, pero a ver, también digo yo una cosa, dentro de 40 años vete tú a saber dónde está la OTAN y por el camino que lleva, igual ni existe. O sea, que es que realmente no creo que a Putin le pareciera una mala idea, pues eso, 40 años, aunque ahora, pues obviamente se lance ese órdago, como bien has comentado, ¿no? De no va a entrar jamás. Bueno, ya veremos. Yo desde luego, al final van a tener que ser cesiones de las dos partes. Al final, más cesión seguramente por parte de Ucrania que por parte de Rusia, pero dice, bueno, pues, si algo tengo que hacer, pues esto tampoco me molesta. Putin dentro de 40 años tampoco va a estar, con lo cual el que venga detrás que se las apañe, ¿no?
Sí, veremos desde luego qué pasa con Ucrania, qué pasa en estas negociaciones entre Putin y Trump. Mientras tanto, si te parece, miramos precisamente lo que ha sucedido en las últimas horas. Ayer con un ataque masivo por parte de Ucrania, con más de 180 drones, con el mayor ataque en territorio ruso, y con la respuesta hoy, de nuevo, con ataques a infraestructura energética ucraniana. Se habla de al menos 40 misiles, más de 70 drones. Llega Donald Trump a la Casa Blanca, que por cierto está poniéndose la medalla ya claramente de lo que sucede en Gaza. Dice que ha sido fruto de las elecciones, de la aplastante victoria que tuvo las elecciones de Estados Unidos, pero en Ucrania parece que va a costar más, ¿no? Sobre todo teniendo en cuenta los últimos eventos. Parece que hay prisa primero por avanzar, que lo está haciendo Rusia, por ejemplo, en el este del Donetsk, mientras los ataques siguen escalando. Digo, ¿hasta dónde va a llegar esto?
¿Hasta dónde? Pues yo creo que Moscú, si se lo plantea, es capaz de llegar a Kiev sin mucho problema. Si se lo plantea. Yo creo que tampoco le interesa tener esa imagen tan, no vamos a decir negativa, ¿no? Vamos a llamarla de esa manera. Si te parece, Sergio, empezando por la segunda parte de Trump ya se está colgando la medalla, sí, es un poco verdad que las elecciones pueden haber acelerado, pero evidentemente llega todavía en tiempo de descuento casi de Biden, con lo cual vamos a darle medallita a los dos, ¿no? Un gallifante a cada uno y ya está. Y con eso tiramos para adelante. Con respecto a lo que comentas de hasta dónde vamos a llegar, bueno, pues hasta donde realmente se puede llegar a firmar la paz. ¿Por qué va a tardar quizás más de lo que se esperaba? A ver, yo le he puesto verano. Sí. Yo creo que más allá de verano no va a llegar. ¿Por qué? Porque hay muchos más elementos en juego. O sea, no nos engañemos que es que no es un Hamas-Israel o no es país A, país B. Es países, vamos a decir, aliados o participativos o vamos a llamarle patrocinadores del conflicto contra Rusia, ¿no? Al fin y al cabo. Entonces, al final todos van a querer llevarse, no digo un pedacito, pero sí llevarse un poquito su reconocimiento en este sentido. Entonces, habrá muchos más puntos, muchísimos más puntos que negociar, eso está clarísimo. Por supuesto la OTAN, por supuesto la Unión Europea, por supuesto territorios, por supuesto me vas a tener que pagar esto, me vas a tener que pagar aquello. Zelensky, como es, pues no deja de enviar pues, ataques, que es verdad que los ataques que consigue Ucrania contra Rusia pues son como muy celebrados, pero es que luego vienen las consecuencias, y las consecuencias son, oye, pues mira, es verdad que personas pues no vamos a matar, porque la verdad es que y eso que es una guerra, pero es que no es buena imagen para nadie siquiera, ¿no? Y además es un desastre el entrar en una guerra y matar gente. Pero tus infraestructuras sí. ¿Dónde te hago más daño? En la energía. ¿Por qué? Porque eso no te permite producir, tu población va a estar molesta, no vas a poder operar, no vas a poder hacer un montón de cosas. Entonces, pues sí, vale, tú me has atacado, bien, vale, me has mandado 70 drones o 70 o 100 o mándame los que te dé la realísima gana, pero que sepas que te voy a hacer sufrir. Y quizás estos ataques, que en un principio nos estaban dando, pero ya ataques directamente a infraestructuras energéticas, pues le está haciendo bastante más daño del que se pensaba a Zelensky. Y Zelensky cada día, no nos engañemos, tiene una peor imagen dentro de la misma Ucrania. Entonces, bueno, es un suma y sigue, es otra muesca en el revólver de Putin.
Pues pendientes de cómo se desarrolla el conflicto en Ucrania, te quiero preguntar también por la OTAN, te quiero preguntar por bueno cómo se queda, ¿no? Después de esta derrota, se puede calificar así en Ucrania, después de que Donald Trump esté amenazando con subir al menos hasta el 5% del PIB, amenazando incluso con salirse. ¿Es el momento más complicado para la OTAN, Diego? Porque estamos escuchando a Omar Rutte que dice ya no solo que hay que cambiar la mentalidad de guerra, sino que el futuro de nuestra seguridad está en juego. Yo creo que nunca se han visto mensajes tan alarmistas, ni siquiera Stoltenberg.
Bueno, a ver, Rutte está diciendo lo que dice porque yo creo que está un poco desorientado, ¿no? Ha llegado en lanza como un paracaidista en medio de un campo de batalla que ni se esperaba. Claro, el momento no es baladí. O sea, estamos hablando que la OTAN, por mucho que diga, no, es una alianza de naciones, no sé qué, mira, perdona, no, esto es un ejército norteamericano pagado en poquito por algunos países participativos. El hecho de subir las cuotas, vamos a llamarle cuotas de participación en el club, pues obviamente no le gusta a nadie, pero es que no hay otra. La OTAN, al final, no olvidemos para qué se creó y qué es lo que está haciendo. Entonces, el futuro de la OTAN yo no lo veo, francamente, muy halagüeño, pero hoy por hoy, por ejemplo, Europa no se puede desprender de ella, con lo cual estamos quizás viendo los últimos momentos de la OTAN tal y como la conocemos en la actualidad. Más que una alianza, terminará siendo, pues, no digo que vaya a ser una empresa de mercenarios, que al final, pues es tú me pagas, yo te protejo, ¿sí? Que es un poco en esencia de lo que se trata. Pero sí que a la OTAN tal y como la conocemos yo creo que estamos asistiendo a sus últimos días. Las consecuencias no. O sea, el camino lógico y normal sería que la propia Unión Europea tuviera su ejército, que esto se lleva hablando desde que se crearon las montañas casi, y no termina de cuajar. Entonces, acabar así de repente con la OTAN, difícil. Que Trump diga que hay que subir las cuotas del club, sí, pero se subirán seguramente, pero no tanto como está pidiendo. Entonces, al final será, pues eso, un elemento participativo con unas cuotas más altas, que el que quiera estar, estará, y para países como España, que le costará una barbaridad, porque desde luego el dinero que nosotros destinamos a defensa es ridículo y vergonzoso a nivel internacional. Pero bueno, eso ya no es de mi competencia.
Bueno, pues pendientes del futuro de la OTAN, de la seguridad en Europa, de la tensión en Ucrania y también este alto el fuego en Oriente Medio, con estas imágenes que ven en sus pantallas los familiares de los rehenes. Diego, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros un día más, un placer. Muchas gracias, muy buenas tardes.
Muchísimas gracias, que tengáis muy buena tarde, gracias, hasta luego.
Igualmente, un placer. Nosotros que seguimos pendientes de lo que acontece en directo con el interrogatorio, con la comparecencia de Marco Rubio, el posiblemente el nuevo secretario de Estado de Estados Unidos, que, ojo, acaba de decir que lo que hizo Putin es inaceptable, pero esta guerra debe terminar. Hablaba antes de hacer concesiones por ambos bandos, que tanto Rusia como Ucrania deben hacer concesiones en este conflicto. Dice que no hay manera de que Rusia invada toda Ucrania, pero que tampoco es realista pensar en que Ucrania pueda recuperar las tierras que ya han sido conquistadas desde el inicio de este conflicto. Marco Rubio, interrogado en estos momentos, lo escuchamos.
Have a vision for Africa, and we're backing it up, not just from the Secretary of State's office, but all the way down to making sure key resources are invested in countering disinformation, as well as making sure that we have personnel in there. It's not a popular post As you know, for many State Department people, we've got to make it that way and let people know that they're helping to define the future of not just the United States, but humanity by focusing on Africa. I cannot let my time expire without talking about the biggest humanitarian crisis going on the planet Earth right now. What is happening in Sudan, it's been called by our country a genocide. There's a famine being declared in areas where you're seeing unbelievable levels of systemic sexual violence going on. I traveled to the Sudan border with Chad and saw humanitarian crises like I'd never seen before, and I've been around the world looking at humanitarian crises. We have a great special envoy who you've already positively name-checked in this confirmation hearing. It is so important and vital that work continue and that we work for diplomatic solutions. There are a lot of our allies who've been implicated in fueling this crisis. This is an opportunity to end this crisis by diplomacy, to bring about one of the most important peace processes there are. And I'm hoping that you and incoming President Trump will prioritize that.
Yeah, in an era in which the term genocide has been misappropriated to almost a global slander, an international slander, this is a real genocide. By its very definition, this is a real genocide. This is the ethnic targeting of specific groups for extermination, for elimination, by groups, by the way, that are being funded by nations that we have alliances and partnerships with in other parts of the world. And we should express that clearly. I think in part of our engagement with the UAE, and it'll have to be a pragmatic engagement. I mean, they're important players in what we hope to resolve in the Middle East. And I think as part of that engagement, we also need to raise the fact that they are openly supporting an entity that is carrying out a genocide. And I think for those who are interested in going out and actually protesting a real genocide, this to be the one, and I just don't see it. I don't see people mentioning it.
It is morally reprehensible that this crisis gets virtually no attention in our country, especially because of the role we should be playing. And my time is over, but I want to say this, no need to respond. But the other place on the planet that gets no attention, that we are responsible for in our hemisphere, is the crisis in Haiti as well.
Correct.
I know that you know this intimately. And again, I just want to keep calling out these moral omissions of our country, often, at least in the press, of an inability to focus our compassion, empathy, and understanding of our interwoven destinies with places like Africa and places like Haiti.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Booker, for that. Those are things that needed to be said. Having said that, you have underlined probably the most difficult crises we have on the planet. And I think everybody's ready to sign up on a path forward. So far, nobody's laid out that path forward. And you're right. We have an obligation to at least try to design a path forward. And when that happens, I have no doubt that we'll pull together Republicans and Democrats and as Americans to do something about this. But I'll tell you, the identifying who are the people there that are the good guys that you can partner with is very, very difficult, as you know. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Rubio, for your comments in that regard. We will move now to Senator Paul.
Senator Rubio, congratulations on your nomination. One of the questions that I've asked over time to secretaries of state, as well as ambassadors and others from the State Department, is can you name for me instances where sanctions have changed behavior for the better? I'm not going to ask you that question now. I'm going to wait till you come back to ask you. There's a preview of what I'll ask you the next time. But the reason I bring that up is that I think hopefully people think of sanctions as a way of trying to modulate behavior. You want better behavior out of a country. A country's doing something you don't like. You'd like them to change their behavior for better through sanctions. And I think it rarely works. And I think we pile more on. Now, some would say, well, sanctions are just to punish them. And we just want to, Russia invaded Ukraine. We're just punishing them. And so as punishment, they kind of work. I don't think they're deterring Russia's behavior or changing it. But really, sanctions can have effect in a couple of ways. I think the threat of a sanction, the same way the threat of a tariff can have an effect on behavior. But once placed, I think a sanction or a tariff only has effect on someone's behavior if you remove it. Now, you mentioned earlier a little bit about discussing ways to unwind some of the sanctions ultimately on Russia. People mentioned, well, we never want to let them sell energy again. No, you have to let people enter back into the world. That's how you're going to get behavioral changes. And it really will have to be part of the peace. If there is going to be a negotiated peace, the one aspect that makes us part of that war are all the sanctions. And so it really should be offered up of removing that and going back to normalcy when we can find a resolution to the war. I'll give you an example of where I think often the State Department loses its sight of its mission. Instead of being the Department of Diplomacy, which I think it's supposed to be, it becomes just an extension of the Department of War and muscle, and we show how strong we are through the State Department. But really, when bellicose statements come from other parts of the government, I see the State Department as the one that shows up and tries to still have a conversation. In the past, I think because of remarks, you had been banned from travel to China. The ambassador that's been nominated also has had statements that make us question whether or not he'll be received in China if he becomes the ambassador to China. When Blinken and Yellen went to China recently, they decided, and I'm not arguing with the goal was to get China not to sell dual-use parts to Russia to use in the war against Ukraine. A noble goal. I share the goal. But they got to China and they shamed them in public and called them names and told them they're terrible people and they should quit doing it. I would argue that there's another way to try to get behavioral changes. I would argue that the opposite of sanctions is trade. And so we have a lot of sanctions on China. If I'd been the one going to China with a mission, I would have said to China very quietly, we may not be able to undo everything, but perhaps we could undo one bit of sanctions that will enhance your economy by X amount if you'll agree to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia. And I think that's just it's a different look on things, and I don't think we're getting it very often. I guess my hope is that you will think about a different way of doing business other than just saying, let's sanction everybody and let's call people names we don't like, because I don't think it helps. I think it actually makes the situation worse. That doesn't mean we curl up in a ball and just say, do whatever you want, but there has to be some give and take. There has to be something we take back. And so I guess my general question to you would be, we know a lot about the stick. We know about sanctions and this and that. Do you see any possibility of any carrot with China to make relations better with China?
Well, let me first say, indeed, I've been strongly worded in my views of China. Let me just point out, they've said mean things about me too. And I'm not sure that they're fans of mine in that regard here. My role now as the Secretary of State is to lead the diplomatic wing of the country, and that will involve engaging them. The fact of the matter is, in a mature and prudent conversation, and I would expect that they, at the end of the day, are also mature and prudent practitioners of foreign policy. They've got 1 billion people and nuclear weapons and a large economy. We have 400 million people, the largest economy in the world, in nuclear weapons. And it is in their interest, our interest, and the interest of the world for two great powers to be able to communicate. In fact, despite everything I have said, I have consistently throughout my career said that it is that geopolitical balance between our countries or imbalance, developing imbalance, that is the greatest risk to global security and prosperity, because that could quickly trigger not just a trade and economic conflict, but an armed one, which could be catastrophic. Never in the history of mankind have two powers like the United States and China ever faced off in a global conflict, and the outcome would be catastrophic, and we should want to avoid it, and so should they. So the bottom line is this: yes, we are going to have to deal with China. They're too big and too important in the world, and they're going to have to deal with us. And my goal is that it is dealt with in a way that furthers our national interest. What cannot continue to happen is that China continues to assume all of the benefits of the international system and none of its obligations, all the benefits of global trade and commerce and none of its obligations. Your point on sanctions are important. I think that one of the things that's happened over time is we have adopted this view that we're going to be involved in less armed conflicts, which I think is a positive, generally speaking, right? Most would agree. The only other alternative left in the toolbox then is economic sanctions. And while I do think that you can question whether it has an impact over the changing the behavior of a country, it can achieve two things. The first is it can deny a nation state the resources they could use to fund more of that activity. Let there be no doubt. If the Iranian regime had more money because of no sanctions, they would have spent more money on Hezbollah and Hamas and their missile program and the Houthis and others. So I do think there is value in that regard. And the second is, to be frank, leverage. When you sit down at a table, let's say we talk about Ukraine and the need to end that conflict. When you get and sit at the table, and the United States is involved in those conversations, hopefully, to reach a peaceful settlement of that conflict, you're going to have to give, not just get. And sanctions and the release of sanctions could be a part of that, assuming that the conditions are appropriate. So I do think sanctions also have a role to play in that regard. But I would not diminish the part about denying resources for governments and countries to carry out nefarious, denying them the ability to have the resources to carry out these nefarious activities.
I think you're right, and the point is probably valid with regard to Iran. Probably not so much with China. I don't think we've denied China resources, and I think their resources extend beyond what we can do. I think our sanctions are more, prodding them, but not really damaging their economic prospects. With regard to the concept of diplomacy and how we make things better, or attempt to make things better, I think if we have absolutes, we tend to not understand really the way diplomacy has to work, because it is about engagement. It's about hearing the other side. It's not about accepting their position, but it's about at least knowing what the position of the other side is. With regard to NATO and Ukraine, to a person, the State Department under the previous administration is adamant, and so are many Republicans, that there is absolutely no way we will ever say that Ukraine could be a neutral country, that absolutely they will be, and it is our absolute prerogative to invite anybody we want to into NATO. Well, we can say that, and we have the ability to do that, but there are consequences to that. And one of the consequences is that, at least from the Russian perspective, they see that as one of the reasons why the war has developed there. And so I think that if you are looking at peace, you have to look at first you have to get to a ceasefire before you even get to real discussions. But if you had a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, I think our sanctions need to be on the table as far as negotiating the removal of them. But I think also the idea of Ukraine being a neutral country as far as a military alliance, if it's not on the table, Ukraine doesn't have that much to offer. I mean, Russia now occupies a good 15-20% of the country. It's been a big bloody war, and they've done it in a sort of World War I fashion, but I don't think they're going anywhere. It is at a stalemate. But the one thing Ukraine has to offer is they won't become part of a military alliance allied against Russia. Just not taking it off the table enhances our ability to negotiate and enhances Ukraine's ability. I think Zelensky's public words have been a little less firm than they had been in the past. But instead, I think we've done the opposite with our diplomacy. Every day it's Blinken, beating the drums. They absolutely be in Ukraine. Do you think that the concept of a neutral Ukraine, not in NATO, can be part of the negotiations to end the war?
Well, obviously, that's something that will ultimately be part of any negotiation. I do agree with your point that if we want to be real here for a second, I think we've lost the art of reality in some of the foreign policy. These are not outcomes that are rarely are they ideal. Sadly, in many cases, our choices in foreign policy are a choice between a bad outcome and an even worse outcome. And that's been true not in the modern era, but throughout the history of diplomacy and nation-state relations. In the case of conflicts such as these, they invariably require concessions. I don't think it would be wise nor appropriate before we're even in office or even in any public forum such as this to discuss the parameters of what those potential concessions can be for either side. Suffice it to say, I do think, to be honest with the committee and the full Senate, if you want to reach agreements to end armed conflict where people are dying on a daily basis and enormous destruction is occurring and a great potential for escalation exists on a daily basis, if we want to be honest about bringing that to an end, true diplomacy will require concessions from every party engaged in those conversations. That's the nature of diplomacy, and it's best conducted directly and in an appropriate forum and not in public. And that can be done, by the way, without abandoning our core principles as a nation or our feelings as a people about what's happened and transpired in that conflict to date.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen. Senator Rubio, good to see you. It was great to sit down with you and talk about some of these important issues yesterday. Let me just say at the outset that I appreciate your response to Senator Booker's question about what's happening in Sudan, specifically as the Biden administration just found that the RSF under Hamedi is engaged in a genocide, and we need to do everything we can to stop what's happening there. You referred obliquely to some of our sort of Gulf partners who have not done what they should be doing. One of them is the UAE, and I've been very clear that the United States should not be providing military assistance to the UAE when the UAE is in turn providing military assistance to a group like the RSF that is committing a genocide in Sudan. And I'm expecting a briefing from the Biden administration by the end of this week as to whether or not their commitments to President Biden to stop doing that have been fulfilled. I want to pick up on a couple of the issues we discussed yesterday. One, as you know, Senator Sullivan and I are the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Foreign Service Caucus. We've passed a number of pieces of legislation through the United States Congress, most recently the Foreign Service Families Act. As you know, and we discussed yesterday, you know the importance of supporting the men and women at the State Department, including the Foreign Service, and I appreciate your willingness to work with us in the caucus to continue to make sure that they have what they need to do their jobs effectively. We also discussed the ongoing war in Ukraine and the importance of supporting the Ukrainian people against Putin's aggression, and I just want to say for the record, I support and endorse everything that Senator Shaheen said on that score, so I don't have to go into great detail. I will say that we know that what happens in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. And it's not just me saying that. That is what we've heard repeatedly from leaders in Japan, leaders in South Korea, and other partners of ours in the Indo-Pacific region. So I hope that we will continue to focus on that, because what we do know is that President Xi has one eye on what's happening in Ukraine and another eye on what's happening in Taiwan and measuring everybody's response. Like you, and we've worked on a bipartisan basis to try to make sure that we meet the challenge of China. Lots of important pieces of legislation that have passed, but none yet to really rise to meeting those challenges. I do support the Biden administration's ongoing efforts to restrict the flow of very high-end technologies, the highest end chips, to China that can be used in their military. We're going to have to work successfully with our allies to do that, just like the Trump administration back in the day worked on the Huawei issue. So my view is that we need to expand that effort. We also discussed the volatile situation in the Middle East. You know, we often talk about the importance of shifting our focus to China and the Indo-Pacific, but we always seem to get dragged back into conflicts in the Middle East. I want to start with Syria. Good riddance to the murderous Assad regime. Obviously, we have a stake in what comes next in Syria, given the fact that it's a very volatile part of the world. I support the very cautious engagement of the Biden administration with HTS, but we should acknowledge their very poisonous genealogy, beginning with al-Qaeda morphing into al-Nusra. The other issue, of course, in Syria is that when you've got a situation like we see today, there are opportunities for ISIS to get further back on its feet, to provide it more oxygen. And as you know, the tip of the spear in our fight against ISIS has been our Syrian Kurdish partners, the SDF. But at this moment, President Erdogan of Turkey has been backing attacks of the so-called Syrian National Army, which Turkey largely controls, against our partners, the Syrian Kurds, which opens the door to a revival of ISIS. Because of the actions of the United States government, Turkey has so far paused that effort. Senator Graham and I have introduced legislation to impose sanctions on Turkey should they renew those attacks in an aggressive way. We talked about this. I know that you recognize the importance of that partnership with the Syrian Kurds, but just a very straightforward question. Do you agree that we should continue to support our partners, the SDF, in the fight against ISIS?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Not only that, but I think we also need to recognize that there are implications to abandoning partners who have a great sacrifice and threat actually jailed the ISIS fighters. One of the reasons why we were able to dismantle ISIS is because they were willing to host them in jails, a great personal threat to them. And obviously that situation is very tenuous. I don't want to take up a lot of your time, but I do think it's important to respond to this opportunity in Syria because it could be an opportunity. Look, the new people that are in charge there are not going to pass an FBI background check, okay? We recognize that. These are not people we know all about, and their history, as you said, is not one that gives us comfort. That said, it is in the national interest of the United States, if possible, to have a Syria that's no longer a playground for ISIS, that respects religious minorities, ranging from Alawis all the way to Christians, that protects the Kurds, and at the same time is not a vehicle through which Iran can spread its terrorism to Hezbollah and destabilize Lebanon, not to mention what's happened in other parts. Not only is it in the national interest of the United States, it's in the national interest of virtually every nation state in the Middle East to see that come about. That is worth exploring. There is an interesting dynamic at play, and Senator Paul asked a moment ago about the impact of sanctions. I would argue that the Caesar sanctions directly contributed to the downfall of the Assad regime in many ways. We find ourselves in this interesting situation now where, because I think it was reauthorized as part of NDAA, we now have these sanctions in place against a government that no longer exists. But nonetheless, it's an opportunity for us to explore how we could use that tool, the removal of it, and others, if in fact the territory is fertile for these outcomes. There are impediments to this that go beyond simply the new people in charge. And one of them, as you pointed out, is Erdogan and what his intentions are. Right now, there's a very tenuous ceasefire with regards to the Kurds. It's important for that to be maintained. I think it's important to signal to Erdogan early, including through this hearing, that they should not view a transition in power in the U.S. as a window in which they could take advantage of to sort of violate whatever agreements are in place. Right now, what we want in Syria is stability so that we can explore what opportunities exist to bring a different dynamic, because it would have an impact on Lebanon, on Israel, on the situation in Gaza, and on the broader Middle East. And to walk away from an opportunity that may not come back. By the way, the Russians have been run out of there, the Iranians have been run out of there, but they are pragmatic foreign policy operators. If we don't explore these opportunities, they will work their way back in there at some point.
And I agree with everything you just said. I look forward to working with you on that. Let me turn to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we also discussed yesterday. And we all witnessed the horrific October 7th Hamas terror attacks on Israel. We've also witnessed the devastation and human rights catastrophe in Gaza. Like you, I've met Israeli families who lost loved ones on October 7th. I've met with hostage families. I've also met with Palestinian families who lost kids and other innocents in this war. So I was very pleased to see the announcement today of the ceasefire and the return of hostages. Let us pray that it holds and that it is implemented. But of course, as we discussed yesterday, the question is what happens next. And we all agree that Hamas can have no role in the governance of Gaza or any other place. We also know that for all its flaws and faults, the Palestinian Authority has recognized Israel's right to exist for the last 30 years since the Oslo Accords. Their security forces are trained by U.S. forces. They today are fighting Palestinian militants in certain parts of the West Bank. But at the same time, their funds have been restricted by the Netanyahu government today. These are the funds that belong to the PA. We've seen a record increase in the number of settlements in the West Bank. And so the PA is not able to deliver on what had been the hope of Oslo, which is self-determination, security, and dignity for both Israelis and Palestinians. So you have said that the ideal way forward, recognizing that we've been at this for a long time, is a two-state solution. There are members of the Netanyahu government that today want to annex all of the West Bank. So my question is, do you agree that annexation would be contrary to peace and security in the Middle East? And what is your vision going forward?
First, let me say that, yeah, the idea would be that there not be conflict and the people could live side by side with one another without being in conflict and the ability to pursue prosperity. Sadly and unfortunately, the conditions for that to exist have not been in place for some substantial period of time. I point to you as an example, back in 2020, the Trump administration offered $58 billion, or about $50 billion, or $58 billion to $50 billion, $58 to $50 billion in investment to the Palestinians. And that included, I believe, 28 or 29 billion specifically for Gaza, and it was rejected. That offer was made back in January of 2020, and then it pivoted over as a result of that rejection to what we now know as the Abraham Accords. Second, I would say that Israel is a small nation who at its narrowest point is 9 miles wide. It has been historically surrounded by enemies that seek their destruction. Hezbollah to the north, Hamas to the west, Iran further north with nuclear weapons, constantly. In fact, I would argue that if Israel had not been firm and strong in its response in this endeavor, most recently, they may very well have faced an existential threat, as they continue to in many ways. Now, here's the good news, and it's not just about the ceasefire today, although that's very important. The good news is that potentially we have had a dynamic shift in the region that has an historic opportunity, if appropriately structured and pursued, that changes the dynamics of what might be possible. And that we've discussed Syria, we've discussed the events in Lebanon quite a bit as well, the degrading of the Iranian capability, which I hope will continue, and hopefully the ability to reach some agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia on normalization and being able to engage both for their mutual security and also economic prosperity. The real open question for the Palestinians is who will govern? Who will govern in Gaza in the short term, and who will ultimately govern? Will it be the Palestinian Authority or some other entity? Because it has to be someone. That was the initial goal for Gaza when the Israelis withdrew from there, and they turned it over. And they turned it over with greenhouses, and they turned it over with all kinds of economic development. Hamas won an election. They took over, and they destroyed the place and built tunnels for terrorists to operate from. So the key is not simply governance. It's who will govern. You can't turn it over to people who seek your destruction. And so I do think this is a very complex issue, and I think that's understating it. We all recognize it. But I also believe that we should not underestimate the potential opportunities that now exist. And it'll take some time to fully understand what those are, that perhaps open the door to things that were not open in the future. But from the Israeli perspective, which I fully understand, it begins with their existence. Because you cannot coexist with armed elements at your border who seek your destruction and evisceration as a state. You just can't. No nation on it. We wouldn't tolerate it, and they can't either. And it begins with having that level of security. And if they do, then I think there are opportunities that come about as a result of it. Those opportunities historically have not existed in recent times. Perhaps we're living in an era where that will be, the likelihood of it is higher because of recent events, unexpected events in Syria and Lebanon and other places.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. So I was in Miami or Hialeah on Monday, and when there's a video where you were recognizing Elena Garcia and Dario Fernandez and Tomas Regalado, everybody applauded. They're so excited about your being the Secretary of State. Your homegrown son, and so they're just all excited. The other thing they're excited about is that they have somebody that is going to care about Venezuela and Cuba and Haiti and Nicaragua, all the problems, because you've been so vocal. So I guess, can you just go through sort of one by one and say, look, we know what are our options? Not that you know exactly what you're going to do, and a lot of these decisions will be made by somebody else anyway, but what are, like right now, look at what's going on in Venezuela. The Biden administration's allowed oil to flow. He stole the election, completely violated what Biden told him he would do. Maria Corina Machado probably was only alive because of your hard work making sure that Donald Trump put a tweet out. You look at Cuba now. They just dropped the state-sponsored terrorism, which makes no sense. We've got people like Jose Daniel Ferrer in prison. Kids as young as 14 in prison for peaceful protests. So give me some of your ideas of what is possible.
Let's take one, but let's start with Haiti, because in many ways it's globally complex. And I think the chairman sort of alluded to this a moment ago. There's a fundamental problem in Haiti in that there is no legitimacy of authority. And I say this in recognition of the fact that some of the national police forces in Haiti have been extraordinarily brave. Despite being outgunned and outmanned, these guys and gals have stuck at their post and fought back against armed gangs. You know, when the most powerful person in any nation state is nicknamed barbecue, that is not a good thing. And this guy obviously is not named that for good reasons. He's not a cook. These are bad gang elements that are operating within Haiti and have destabilized not just Haiti, but threatened to destabilize the Dominican Republic, not to mention the migratory pressure that it places on the United States, on the Bahamas, and on other places in the region. There is no easy answer. The Kenyans are there, and I can tell you, I think they deserve a lot of credit for being willing to take on that mission. In recent days, missions from various other countries have arrived, El Salvador being among them, to sort of contribute to that effort. I don't think anyone can tell you they have a master plan for how you fix that overnight. I do think it does begin with stability and security. You've got to establish some baseline security, and it's not going to come from a U.S. military intervention. So to the extent that we can encourage foreign partners, and I would include foreign partners in the Western Hemisphere, who should be contributing to this effort, to provide some level of stability and security in Haiti so that you can explore the opportunities to have a transitional government that has legitimacy, that can ultimately lead to the conduct of elections, and then have governing bodies in that country that can bring about a nation state that can begin to build some of the things you need in order for permanency. But it's going to take a long time. And I say this with sadness in my heart. There have been good times and there have been bad times and worse times in Haiti, but sadly, there's not really been a golden era in Haiti's history, and your heart breaks for these people and for what they've gone through. But you also, as a policymaker in the United States, recognize the implications it's had on our country, not just in the migratory pressures it's placed on us, but as I pointed out earlier, the threat it poses on a daily basis to destabilizing the Dominican Republic. You mentioned Nicaragua. It's a very weird situation, for lack of a better term. The Sandinistas earlier, one of the first things they did in the new year is they kicked out every nun in the country. They've gone to war with the Catholic Church, which was the last institution in the country capable of standing up to them. But now they've begun this process of amending their fake constitution to basically create a family dynasty so that Ortega and his wife will now be co-presidents. There's no democracy that's been completely wiped out. They have literally put plane loads of opposition figures and exported them here to the United States and around the world. They literally arrested anyone who signed up to run for president. They arrested every single, you signed up to run for president, they put you in jail. So it's a big challenge, but our national interest is most challenged. Number one, because of migratory pressure. Number two, because the Nicaraguan regime is allowing people to fly into Nicaragua visa-free from anywhere in the world and then transit to the United States. They have become the point of entry for people from all over the world because you come in without any visa. They charge you $1,000 or whatever the going rate is today. And from there, you get on the migratory route and into the United States. They have been direct contributors to the migratory crisis we face at our southern border. And the third is the Nicaraguans have basically invited the Russians to establish a military naval presence in Nicaragua, in our hemisphere. That poses a threat to our national security. That needs to be addressed. Venezuela, sadly, is not governed by government. It's governed by a narco-trafficking organization that has empowered itself of a nation state. And we have seen, I believe, upwards of 7, 8, 9 million Venezuelans have just left the country. More are expected to leave. I was in strong disagreement with the Biden administration because they got played the way that I knew they would get played. They entered into negotiations with Maduro. He agreed to have elections. The elections were completely fake. They leveraged migration against us to get those concessions. And now they have these general licenses where companies like Chevron are actually providing billions of dollars of money into the regime's coffers. And the regime kept none of the promises that they made. So all that needs to be re-explored. Because in Venezuela, you have the Russian presence, you have a very strong Iranian presence. The Iranians, in fact, are exploring, or in fact, are beginning to build drone factories for the manufacture of Iranian drones in our own hemisphere. Not to mention the long practice of the Venezuelan regime of providing real but illegitimate passports to operatives for Hezbollah in our own hemisphere. And lastly, and I leave it lastly to Cuba because it's one that's been more enduring, the problem in Cuba basically is that despite being a communist regime and Marxism not working, is that they've decided, and they thought what they would do is that they would create this holding company. It's called Gaesa. It is a company that they own by the Cuban military, and that holding company owns everything that makes money in Cuba. If it makes money in Cuba, they own it, and it generates revenue for them. The Miami Herald just did an expose on Gaesa. And while you have electrical blackouts and you have all these other problems economically in Cuba, Gaesa is sitting on billions of dollars that they've generated for their permanency. In 2017, the Trump administration sanctioned Gaesa. Unfortunately, the Biden administration lifted some of those sanctions and restrictions a couple of years ago, which increased the amount of money they're able to generate through things like manipulating remittances and the like. And then yesterday, the Biden administration announced they were rescinding all of the sanctions on Gaesa, which basically the sanctions were this. You can do business with an independent individual Cuban, but you cannot, it's the regime that doesn't allow it. You cannot do business with anything owned by that government-run entity. And yesterday they lifted the sanctions on them. Now, the new administration is not bound by that decision, but nonetheless, that's what's in place. Ultimately, the reality, the moment of truth is arriving. Cuba is literally collapsing, both generationally in terms of all the young people leaving, but it's also collapsing economically. They are now living on 20 and 21-hour rolling blackouts and some days longer because Marxism doesn't work, because they're corrupt, and because they're inept. And they're going to have a choice to make, those that are in charge there. Do they open up to the world? Do they allow the individual Cuban to have control over their economic and political destiny, even though it threatens the security and stability of the regime? Or do they triple down and just say, we'd rather be the owners and controllers of a fourth world country that's falling apart and has lost 10% of its population in the last 2 years? And that's a dynamic that they're facing right now. I hope that they will choose the path of empowering the individual Cuban, so that the individual Cuban has the ability to do what the peoples of virtually every other country in the hemisphere have been able to do at least once in the last 60 years, and some more than once, and that is elect their leaders, vote for their leaders. You think about what happened here today. The Cuban people have no idea what it's like to have an authority figure or someone in charge and power, like I am as a US Senator, sitting here, having to answer questions from his colleagues, and also having to have people in the back screaming and protesting against you. You can't do that to a Cuban official. You can't question their decisions. The Cuban people have never been able to participate in a political process for almost 70 years now. And they're entitled to that as much as the people of Colombia and Argentina and Paraguay and Peru and virtually every other country in the region has enjoyed.
So let's assume you have this job, you're confirmed, you have the job for 4 years. What would your definition of success be?
With regards to generally?
Your job.
The alignment of our foreign policy to our national interest has been defined, the security, prosperity of the American people. And that's, and by the way, I would define that as success for the country. What I would define as success for the State Department is not just that alignment, but making the State Department highly relevant again. Sadly, and I think I've shared this with you in some of our meetings with many of my colleagues, what has happened over the last 20 years under multiple administrations is the influence of the State Department has declined at the expense of other agencies and also at the expense of national security councils, because it takes so long for the State Department to take action. And so increasingly you stop getting invited to the meetings and they stop putting you in charge of things because it takes too long to get a result. So we want the State Department to be relevant again, and it should be, because the State Department has a plethora of talented people who are subject matter experts and who have skills in diplomacy, and it's not being fully utilized because increasingly on issue after issue, we've seen the State Department marginalized because of internal inertia, because of the way the structure works. So we have to be able to we have to be at that table when decisions are being made, and the State Department has to be a source of creative ideas and effective implementation. So I would define making the State Department relevant again in the setting of our foreign policy is critical. And I think that's something that maybe is not as perceived by the general public as it is by those of us who watch it on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, for holding this hearing and for welcoming me to the committee. You know, I'm joining this committee at a challenging time for the global community, from conflicts with Iranian proxies in the Middle East to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, growing tensions with China, a genocide in Sudan, and so much more. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to find bipartisan solutions to these problems. And I also want to thank you, Senator Rubio, your family that's here, and those who couldn't be here, for working with me over the last 6 years and your service to our nation. And I'd like to congratulate you again on your nomination. And I'm going to move on. I just want to make a quick statement, because ensuring the United States remains a steadfast supporter of Israel, I know, is one of your top priorities and one of mine. And throughout your time in the Senate, you've been one of Israel's most unwavering supporters. I want to thank you for supporting Israel. I look forward to working with you to ensure that the U.S.-Israel security partnership remains ironclad and that our friendship remains unconditional. And I want to thank you for your response to Senator McCormick's hostage question. We all hope, since we've been in this hearing, that there's news maybe of an imminent agreement being reached to free, I hope, all the hostages. We hope to hear that confirmation soon. But nevertheless, these issues must remain a top priority for the committee going forward. So I'm going to just move over to talking about Abraham Accord, speaking of going forward, because despite the immense challenges that you've addressed posed by October 7th, the Abraham Accords have ushered in new forms of cooperation between Israel and countries in the Middle East and North Africa. As one of the founders and co-chairs of the bipartisan Senate Abraham Accords Caucus, I firmly believe the U.S. should continue building on the accords by deepening people-to-people ties, soft diplomacy, if you will, and widening the circle of partnerships with Israel to new countries. So, Senator Rubio, I know you've touched on this briefly, but if confirmed, how will you support the growth of the Abraham Accords to new countries generally, and specifically maybe try to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
Thank you. I think those are important points. A couple of things that have come up here as a result of this. The first is, and I point this again because we just don't know, it's a new development, but I think we should not underestimate or understate the potential historic opportunities that exist right now with what's happened very unexpectedly for most in Syria, what's happened in Lebanon, the weakening of Iran and of its Shia crescent of destabilization in the region. These are extraordinary opportunities that I think lend themselves to an era of diminishing insecurity, not total the elimination of it, but enough security that it opens the door for agreement on other topics. Critical to that is the potential of a Saudi normalization with Israel. And I think that, as part of a broader context of the Abraham Accords, I think would be historic in nature, and I think provide extraordinary benefits to the world and help bring a level of stability and peace to an area that, frankly, has not had it, one could say, for thousands of years, but certainly in my lifetime. You talk about what we could do to build on it. I think the most important part of any arrangement of countries that enter into these agreements that historically have been difficult is there has to be a benefit to it. They have to perceive that there's a benefit to it, particularly among themselves. Like, what is the benefit to a country? What benefits will Saudi Arabia derive from being in recognition of Israel and vice versa? And I could think of a variety of things, whether it's advances in what their investments in high tech, and how Saudi Arabia wants to diversify its own economy, the ability of cross investments, and also, frankly, of security. Because for the foreseeable future, I think most anticipate that there will be a mutual threat from Tehran. It may not be openly stated as a military alliance, but it's certainly certainly one that I think they both have a mutual interest in, and which I think the U.S. could be a very strong partner in providing those assurances as well. So I do think there's a real opportunity to expand it, and it won't be without irritants. There's no doubt about it. There won't be without irritants. That we're still going to have some issues with UAE or Saudi Arabia, but we also have to be pragmatic enough to understand what an enormous achievement it would be if, in fact, not just you get a ceasefire, but you actually, that leads to the opening, the opportunity of a Saudi-Israeli partnership and joint recognition. What that would mean to the region is historic.
And you've talked about potential opportunities going forward. And we talk about maybe not just with other countries, but how does the private sector get involved in creating building and sustaining the normalization in areas of water insecurity, power insecurity, healthcare, technology? We know that there are ways that we can do this. They have been doing it. How does the private sector feed into this?
I think from an economic and development perspective, they're the linchpin of it. I think one of the things that could come about as a result of an agreement between the Saudis and the Israelis is that companies and institutions in both countries would now be open and able to invest in and or partner in the economies of each other. So the Israelis, as an example, have made extraordinary advances in agricultural production. Because of geographic constraints. They've had to be incredibly creative and nonetheless have been able to, and I think the Saudis would benefit from that greatly. Likewise, I think that we know, as a startup nation, that the technological capabilities and advances that the private sector has made in Israel, and that I think would be a great interest to the Saudis in partnership. In reverse is, I think, some of the energy resources that Saudi Arabia could provide, some of the financing for projects that they work together on. The linchpin of all of these is private sector engagement. But without the governmental imprimatur, or without the government creating the pathways for that to be possible, because of recognition, because of diplomatic relations, that's what opens that because those don't exist, that hasn't been able to happen. This would open the door for that, and I think be transformative.
Thank you. I want to continue a little bit on this theme because, of course, a lot of this also has a nexus with combating anti-Semitism, and of course, anti-Semitism domestically and abroad. I proudly founded the first ever Senate bipartisan task force to combating anti-Semitism. You and I have done a lot of work there. You're a member of the task force, and we work closely with the Special Envoy's office at the State Department. We know that global rates of anti-Semitism, they are skyrocketing. It's critical the White House ensures the special envoy in their office is sufficiently staffed, supported, and resourced. So I know we've talked about this in our meeting, and of course, like I said, we worked on this before. Can I have your commitment that you'll work with the White House to do two things? Quickly nominate a qualified candidate to be special envoy. Quickly and qualified. We really need to get somebody on board.
Yes, and I think it needs to be someone that, as we've discussed, also enjoys broad support across different sectors. But the key ultimately is, there was I don't know if it was a study or a survey or something that came out yesterday, but it showed something that's really disturbing. I think it said 60% of people on Earth hold anti-Semitic views, according to this poll, or in 60% of the countries, but I think it's a 60%. Look, unfortunately, bigotry and hatred has been a part of human nature from the very beginning, but anti-Semitism is a unique danger. The suffering that it inflicted on the world historically, but in the last century, is unimaginable and can never be allowed to be repeated. And it's something that we should make sure we're constantly speaking out against and identifying for what it is. I think the U.S.'s role as a leader in speaking out in that regard is indispensable. And we need to be forceful about it. One of the things that's most troubling is what seemed to me that one of the things that's undermining the legitimacy of many of our international organisms is they've become havens for anti-Semitic activity. That oftentimes is disguised as anti-Israel, but I believe is frankly anti-Semitic. And of course, we've seen incidents of that in the United States as well. We cannot ignore what anti-Semitism has cost humanity in the past, because if that lesson is forgotten, it will very quickly repeat itself and potentially in every region on the planet.
Thank you. I want to just quickly, a yes or no. We know we've talked a lot about how important deputies are in mission sets of different things. We know that if we don't have a deputy envoy in place, they keep the wheels turning. They keep the organization going for the waiting for the special envoy to be confirmed. Do I have your commitment that we'll quickly put in a deputy envoy to make sure that the work can continue until?
Yeah, we'll work to do that as soon as possible.
Thank you. I wanted to, I only have 56 minutes. I do not have 56 minutes. I have 56 seconds. That would be a little crazy. I know that the first Trump administration created the Women's Global Development Prosperity Initiative. It was the first whole of government initiative to promote women's economic empowerment, dedicated to global resourcing for these activities. As Secretary, will you commit to continuing to expand on the WGDP initiative, and if so, in what ways?
Yeah, and that was a high priority of Ivanka Trump, who's no longer going to be in government, but was at the time, and she worked on that very much. And I was a supporter of it then, and look forward to being a supporter of it now, if confirmed.
Thank you. And we got that 56 minutes went awfully fast. There you go. I yield back, Mr.
Time
Chairman.
flies.
You yield back all 8 seconds?
Yes.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can barely see you down there.
I know. I was there one time.
They had to extend the dais so Senator Curtis and I could actually sit with the big boys and girls table. So, Senator Rubio, it's great to see you. I have complete confidence in your ability to lead the State Department. I think it's an inspired choice, and you couldn't be better prepared for that job. I do want to ask you a few questions, some of which I know Senator Cruz is here as well. He and I share a concern about Mexico. You've heard some concerns, particularly about the cartel activity, but I want to talk to you about water. 1944, there was a water treaty between the United States and Mexico, and we have had chronic problems getting Mexico to cooperate and release the water that's been absolutely critical to the life and the livelihood of our agriculture community in the Rio Grande Valley and elsewhere. We've had I've talked to Secretary Blinken about this. We've written letters. We've done everything we know how to do, but I would just like to get your commitment to work with us to try to just simply get Mexico to live up to its requirements under the treaty. And if they won't do it voluntarily, to look for leverage and ways we can persuade them to do what they already have a legal obligation to do, which is to release water on a timely basis.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons why we need to do that is twofold. The first is because it has real implications, not just for the state of Texas, but broadly for the United States. But the second is because I think this has become part of a pattern, and I would argue part of a pattern in a number of international arrangements, but in particular international arrangements with Mexico, in which you can strike any deal you want or sign any document you want, but if you're not willing to prioritize its enforcement, you are encouraging others to get away with the same thing. And at the same time, you're undermining the willingness of people to commit to enter into agreements in the future. And this has become we've seen it with USMCA, frankly. We've seen it with a variety of other commitments that have been made by partners in other parts of the world. And we're seeing it with this treaty. Where there is a treaty, they have obligations under it, and they don't seek to meet it. And it's part of the broader challenge that I alluded to in my opening statement, which is we've entered this era where we've entered into all these international arrangements, but oftentimes they've been weaponized either through non-compliance or through a creative reinterpretation. And that extends to trade all the way down to treaties such as this.
Speaking of Mexico, I know that in different quarters we've had people suggest that the cartels be identified as a foreign terrorist organization. And as I've looked into that, it feels like the right thing to do because, of course, the cartels are wreaking havoc and misery and death and destruction, not only here in the United States, but also in Mexico. But I worry a little bit about some of the unintended consequences. For example, does that create some new category of asylum, perhaps, for people who claim that they are victims of cartel activity that otherwise wouldn't exist? What's your view about the designation?
Well, and I think this question was asked earlier, so I'll tell you what I said. The first is that they most certainly are terroristic in their nature. They terrorize Mexicans, they terrorize on the U.S. side. They are involved in the trafficking of women and children, of labor, and both labor and sex trafficking, deadly fentanyl, and drugs writ large, as you can imagine. And I think, pose a grave danger in the process of trafficking people, trafficking terrorists into the United States. So they are terroristic in nature. What I said was that whether it's that designation or some new designation that we create, it is important that they be identified for what they are. I also pointed to something you just alluded to in your question, and that is they pose a grave risk to Mexican sovereignty as well. We have seen multiple journalists and politicians and candidates assassinated, murdered in Mexico by cartels because either they're not the cartel's chosen candidate or there are journalists that spoken out against the cartels and you find yourself murdered. And I don't think we should underestimate, and I hope the Mexicans do not, the amount of leverage that they have created over the Mexican government. And in some parts of Mexico, they are, in fact, have operational control of territories, particularly near the U.S.-Mexican border. So this is something that I hope we can work with jointly and cooperatively with the Mexicans to address, because it's in their interest as well as ours. Ultimately, I do not think I speak out of turn when I say that you can expect President Trump will do whatever it takes to secure the United States of America and the American people from the threat that they pose. But it is my sincerest hope, and frankly, I think the most productive outcome would be if we could do so in partnership and cooperation with the government of Mexico, who I know shares many of our concerns.
Well, that certainly should be our first choice, but I have the same confidence you have that President Trump will send a very clear message and follow that up with decisive action to persuade Mexico to do what it is in its best interest. And because it's an intolerable situation right on our southern border. We can't get a divorce. We got to make the marriage work somehow. And but it's a troubled marriage, shall I to continue the analogy. Let me talk to you briefly about the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is within the jurisdiction of this committee. This is something I've been concerned about for some time because we have lobbyists that work here in Washington, D.C. that actually represent foreign nations that, unbeknownst to members of Congress, they're actually advocating not on behalf of the American people and American interests, but on behalf of the interests of foreign nations. Now, there is a loophole called the Lobbyist Disclosure Act, which is frankly weak sauce when it comes to providing the kind of transparency that we need. Anytime somebody shows up in your office and is advocating for something purporting to represent American interests, but in fact is there motivated by and being paid by a foreign interest to advocate their interest, is that something that you would be willing to work with us to further reform and refine?
Yes, and as you know from our time serving together on the Intelligence Committee as well, it's something we spend a lot of time talking and thinking about as well. And I would raise 2 points. The first there is, look, the straight up, some foreign government hires a lobbyist. You know that because they're registered and we're aware of it. The second is more nefarious, and that is that you hire someone through a cutout, a third party, without aware of the fact that they are in fact being paid by a foreign entity, and sometimes dressed up as an American interest, when in fact it's furthering the interest of a foreign entity. And then the third, and it's one that I don't think gets talked about enough and it isn't covered by this law, but needs to be said, is some of the most effective and vociferous lobbyists on behalf of Chinese interests in the United States for a long time was U.S. corporations who had a pretty good deal going in China with regards to manufacturing and the like, and would come here and argue in favor of outcomes and policies that favored China. And by the way, China would weaponize this openly. They would, in fact, bring in CEOs of corporate America and encourage them to go back and talk to your member of Congress and tell them they better not do that, because if they do, companies like yours are not going to do very well in China. And that was weaponized against us, too. That's not illegal, but it's most certainly troubling and something we need to have our eyes open to as well as we move forward.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my last question, and this has to do with outbound investment transparency. As you know, the Senate has passed legislation providing for a reporting requirement for American companies who are investing in China. It's not a prohibition. It's merely a disclosure requirement because the unique circumstances that you're well aware of that China provides. There is no division between civilians or the private sector and government. Under Chinese law, the private sector, so-called private sector, is required to share any and all information that might be of use to the People's Liberation Army or to the Chinese intelligence agencies. And it is not a stretch to say that due to the tactics of people like, or strategies really, of people like Deng Xiaoping, who said, hide your motives and bide your time, we've seen massive U.S. investment in China, which has not only helped them rebuild their economy, which is fine, but more ominously rearm their military, modernize their military so that they become a threat not only to their neighbors in the region, but to world peace. We can all imagine a nightmare in which China decides to take Taiwan, which President Xi said he's committed to do. So I think it just makes sense for us to have more transparency so that as policymakers, we can then figure out what is the right policy. I could care less whether American companies want to build more Burger Kings or Starbucks in China, but I do care if American companies are investing in dual purpose technology or in ways that would undermine the national security of the United States. Do you share that concern?
Absolutely. And in fact, I shared it beyond just simply what you've discussed. This was a few years ago when the thrift savings plan, the retirement 401k basically for federal workers, was investing in funds that are going directly to Chinese military use. So you think about it, there were people serving in the armed forces of the United States whose retirement funds were being invested in companies that were building the weapons designed to one day blow the ship that they served on, even the Indo-Pacific. And in the case of other private sectors, you're right, every sector is not created equal in terms of the threat they pose to our country. But at a minimum, we should have insight into whether American investment dollars, be they institutional or individual, are going through the funding of activities designed to undermine the United States of America. That's a core national security interest.
Thank you and Godspeed.
Senator Kaine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Shaheen, welcome the opportunity to work with you in this Congress. Senator Rubio, congratulations on your nomination. If you're watching the hearing, you probably noticed senators coming in and out, and most people understand why that is, but for those who don't, we have a lot of other hearings, a lot of other responsibilities. We get in a queue and kind of know when our questioning time is coming up. I decided that I would show up, albeit 11 minutes late, and stay because this is so important to the country and to me. But I think for those of you who have watched this hearing that was gavelled in at 10, what you've seen is a nominee who is extremely well prepared. We're used to seeing nominees who know a lot about a couple of things, and sometimes who know very little about virtually everything. But I think you've seen a hearing with a nominee who agree or disagree with the points he's made. He's not talking out of a briefing book. He's not having a thumb through a binder to decide how to answer a particular question. I've always been struck in working with Senator Rubio on this committee since I came to the Senate in January of 2013, that he has a very well-developed sense of the world and a passion and interest in all corners of it. I was particularly happy that he was nominated for two reasons. One, we have worked together significantly on legislation touching many different areas over the years, and one was referred to by Senator Shaheen, legislation to send a clear message that NATO and the U.S. participation in NATO is not just simply an executive priority that could come and go depending upon the Article 2 Commander-in-Chief, but it was also something so important that Congress would say that the membership of the United States in NATO is something that Congress would want to weigh in on should there ever be a decision by an executive that we should back out of NATO. And I think sending that message from Congress has been a very important thing that has led to a NATO that is expanding. Finland and Sweden, where the polling would have been de minimis 10 years ago for joining NATO, are now in. And I think a strong message from Congress is part of that. Obviously, the fear of Russia is a huge part of it, but a strong message of congressional support is part of it. I'm particularly proud that the Virginia National Guard has now struck a deal under the State Partnership Program where we are partners with the military in Finland, a very capable military. And the first exercises of the Virginia Guard with the Finnish military will start next month. I'm very excited about that. The second reason I was particularly gratified to see Senator Rubio nominated for this position is he cares about the Americas. I cast my first vote in a presidential election in 1976. I have not seen a single administration, Democratic or Republican, that has devoted enough attention to the Americas. We devote attention to it in a time of crisis and then move our attention elsewhere. It seems like secretaries of state have often thought that the world only has an east-west axis and not a north-south axis. And Senator Booker addressed that with his questions around the attention that should be paid by the United States to Africa. I feel that very strongly about the Americas. I don't have to ask Senator Rubio questions to gauge his interest and attention level. Everyone who comes before the committee tells us they're really interested in the Americas, only to find that they end up spending all their time somewhere else. I don't have to ask that question of this nominee to know that he has a passion about the nations that are our nearest neighbors, a passion about the nations who are so connected to us in our cultural roots and in our family ties. And it is so important, not just because China and other nations are now getting into the area. I don't want to have a new Monroe doctrine that we only care about it to keep Europe out of it. We only care about it to keep China out of it. We ought to be paying attention because we're connected to these nations, and things will go better for us if things go better for them. So to you, Senator Rubio, I'm very, very happy that you're nominated for this position. Two comments, then one particular question. One, the status of career ambassadors. I think it is a norm for every administration to ask ambassadors to tender their resignations. And it is certainly the norm for the political ambassadors to be politely let go the day that the new administration comes into place. And I think that's an expectation that everybody has. We get that. For the career ambassadors that are in place, they have been asked to tender their resignations to the incoming administration, and that's normal. But I would hope that the administration would consider, if their career, keeping him in place until their successors are ready. Because to swap out a career ambassador for a career chargé does not advance our ability in any way to operate in nations. There is a cachet that comes with being a confirmed ambassador that really helps you with continuity in diplomacy in these nations. So I know that that's a decision that the president makes, but I hope as you have a conversation with the national security and diplomacy team, you might encourage the administration. Yes, you're going to replace the politicals with career chargés, but don't replace the career ambassadors unless you're ready to put somebody in place, which we know can often take quite a while for the administration to even forward nominees, much less the time to get through the committee process. That would be a comment. And then second is more for colleagues, really, rather than for Senator Rubio. One thing I've tried to be consistent on in my service on this committee is fight against unilateral executive application of military power, unless it's in pure instances of imminent self-defense, active self-defense, or self-defense against imminent hostilities. And I have been able to get this committee to pass significant war powers resolutions under 3 different presidents now: President Obama, a Democrat, President Biden, a Democrat, and President Trump, a Republican. And I just wanted to assure everybody that I'm going to continue to be a stickler that the nation shouldn't be at war without a vote of Congress, except in the instances of imminent self-defense. And I will do that because I have done that under presidents of both parties, and I'll continue. Senator Rubio, now to the question. And you alluded to this very briefly in one of the comments that you made about the nation of Paraguay. Not only do we not devote enough attention to the Americas, but when we do, we devote attention to the headaches. And the headaches abound in the Americas and elsewhere. And so we've talked about Haiti, a problem. We've talked about Venezuela, a problem. But so often we don't pay attention to lift up, elevate, provide resources to celebrate the nations in the Americas that are doing things right. And so when I travel through the region, and I'm sure you've heard the same thing, I hear these nations that are doing things right. Why won't you pay attention to us? Ecuador threw out a pro-China government, put a pro-US government. All they wanted was a trade deal. We want to be closer to the United States. We're the only nation on the Pacific coast of the Americas that doesn't have a trade deal with the United States. This administration, I've been critical about the Biden administration, didn't do anything to advance that cause. Talk to us about some of the nations in the Americas that you think are doing things right, and what we ought to do to help those nations, because we'll be much more likely to spread the right if there are other nations in the region that are doing better and better and better than if we're just trying to lecture people about how to improve.
Well, just as a general matter, one of the things that's always struck me is that the region, and then maybe this is true in other parts of the world as well, but particularly in the region, it's almost better to be America's adversary or enemy than friend, because there's the impact of friendship or the benefits of friendship are not tangibly clear to a lot of them. And you know, I've seen that expressed time and again over multiple years. And it's easy to pay attention to a headache. You're going to sanction, you know, some country that's not acting in anti-American ways, but the people that are sort of doing it the right way or want to be cooperative, they're ignored, and the countries that are doing it the right way are ignored. So I think there are a number of countries that right now, as we speak, and I always say this with caution because I may not mention one country and they say, well, they left us out, but I just want to point to a few that I think are present and clear for us. You mentioned one with Ecuador. Ecuador was actually left out of CAFTA because at the time, the people in charge didn't want to be a part of anything with us. They're facing some real security threats that are unique to Ecuador's history. And they're facing these threats because you've got violence and gangs coming over from the Colombian border and then pushing up through Ecuador as a transit country, but they bring with it the turf fights and the gangs, and to the point where last year there was a real threat to the stability of the government, where they took over television stations and things of this, these armed elements did. And there's a lot we can do and have done, but can do. Not a lot. We're not talking about a lot of money. We're not even talking about money in many cases, just equipment to help them at least to restore some sense of stability. The other thing that Ecuador, these are just off topics, but I think they're all relevant. Ecuador faces a very significant challenge with illegal fishing off their coasts by Chinese fishing fleets who violate their territorial waters on an almost daily basis in massive quantities, and it's an ecological crisis as well on top of it. That's a country that can use our help tremendously. I think about the Dominican Republic. People don't talk about the Dominican Republic enough, and they face a real challenge because of Haiti and the instability next door. They were also one of the countries that emerged from COVID the fastest, and not just because of the tourism return quicker there, and they've really been able to do some positive things. I think Argentina, I know people, some have not met the new president of Argentina. This is a serious, well-trained economist. I would not if you sit down and talk to him for a few minutes, he has real clear ideas about economic development and is doing some really necessary things in terms of restructuring the direction of Argentine economics in a way that I think is very positive.
Can I just say to every other nation out there that thinks you're a good guy, he was about to mention you, but my time has expired. But please focus on the good guys and let's help them do better and better and better and be good examples in the region. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent point, Senator Keane. Excellent point. Senator Curtis, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. It's great to be with you today. Great to be on this committee. Senator Rubio, for the last 7 years, from a distance of about 600 feet, that's what separates the House chamber and the Senate chamber, I've watched and admired your work from a distance. And on a few, but very fortunate times, I've had the chance to actually be wind at your back on some of your work supporting Taiwan and protecting Hong Kong dissidents as we work together on some legislation. Now, in a twist of events, I sit not far from where you once sat, and there's another symbolic 600 feet between us, between the State Department and the Senate. And I'm excited to work with you in your new role. And I would like to continue to be wind at your back on a lot of issues, and none more important to me than China. And if you remember really nothing else about our short interchange today, please know that that's very important to me. And I hope to work with you on what I do with the aggression of China, and in many ways.
Silver Gold Patrimonio nace en 2018 con el objetivo de innovar en el mercado de los metales preciosos de inversión, ofreciendo nuevas alternativas para que cualquier persona, familia o empresa pueda entrar en el fantástico mundo de los metales de inversión de forma sencilla y acompañada por consultores expertos en el sector. Silver Gold Patrimonio quiere avanzar contigo.
Mudarte de ciudad es un gran cambio y alquilar tu casa puede parecer arriesgado. ¿Estará tu vivienda protegida? Con SEAC, olvídate de preocupaciones. Nosotros garantizamos tu renta, pase lo que pase. Disfruta de tu nueva etapa con total confianza. Alquila tranquilo. SEAC responde.
No puede volver atrás y cambiar el principio, pero puede comenzar donde está y cambiar el final. En Luna Sevilla queremos ser su asesor financiero de referencia para mejorar su presente y su futuro patrimonial, prestando nuestros servicios como agentes de Caser Asesores Financieros. Somos una empresa con una clara apuesta por la formación de calidad, la información transparente y objetiva, y por el asesoramiento financiero personalizado y continuado. Visite nuestra web lunasevilla.es o llame al 91 762 3442.
¿Qué cuento quieres hoy? ¿Te cuento uno de los míos? ¿El del farmacéutico? ¿O el de María, la abogada?
El de Ana, la arquitecta.
Vale. Eres una niña que soñaba con crear los edificios más impresionantes de la Tierra. Se pasaba el día dibujándolos. Sabía que algún día acabarían llegando a lo más alto de cada ciudad. Y que cualquier persona...
Cada profesional tiene detrás una historia increíble. Creer en ella es lo que de verdad cuenta. Arquia Banca, el banco de los profesionales.
Creemos que la sociedad actual necesita más arte y más color. Le da a la gente la oportunidad de asimilar diferentes perspectivas. Es realmente un placer pintar este cuadro, porque es una hermosa imagen para comenzar. Lo último que pintaremos es el auricular en vez del pendiente.
Using a classic and merging it with modern. This is very provoking.
Vuélvete máster de tu futuro. Obtén tu Master of Finance con doble titulación de Tulane University, Estados Unidos, y de UFM, en Madrid.
Ordenadores distribuidos por todo el mundo y no en un sitio único. Esto hace que la red blockchain presente una serie de ventajas como la privacidad, la descentralización o la no dependencia de un ejecutor centralizado o la seguridad. Hay 4 tipos de blockchain. Por ejemplo, hay una blockchain pública, también conocida como sin permisos, que es aquella en la que cualquiera puede participar sin restricciones. Suele ser la más común en las criptomonedas. También hay blockchains privadas.
Bueno, decíamos que este año va a ser un espectáculo. Hay que ir para la economía mundial. Ahora sí que hay que ir a Davos. Este año Davos va a ser para con las palomitas a 5.000 euros la palomita. Dije que no volvería. Pero vamos a ir, pero este año hay que ir. Este año hay que ir. Este año Davos, pues van a estar todos descolocados. Mira, guarda el libro del nuevo orden. ¿Tú te vienes a Davos? Hay que ir a Davos. Hasta luego, mano.
¿Qué cuento quieres hoy? ¿Te cuento uno de los míos? ¿El del farmacéutico? ¿O el de María, la abogada?
El de Ana, la arquitecta.
Vale. Eras una niña que soñaba con crear los edificios más impresionantes de la Tierra. Se pasaba el día dibujándolos. Sabía que algún día acabarían llegando a lo más alto de cada ciudad. Y que cualquier persona...
Cada profesional tiene detrás una historia increíble. Creer en ella es lo que de verdad cuenta. Banca, el banco de los profesionales.
Vuélvete máster en transformar tu carrera. Obtén tu Master in Management con doble